Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the Provo Municipal Council work session. Today is Tuesday, July 20th, 2021. The time is 1:34. Thank you. Before proceeding with today's work session agenda, I just wanted to advise and remind that the regular public meeting normally held at 5:30 tonight has been canceled. Meetings of the Municipal Council are now being held in hybrid fashion. Members of the public may continue to view council meetings on YouTube and Facebook, or they may attend in person in the council chamber at the Provo City Center. The mayor, councilors, city staff, and any presenters are participating in the council chamber or by using Zoom webinar. The coronavirus pandemic is not yet over, but vaccines are available. We encourage everyone who is eligible to get vaccinated. We encourage all people to protect themselves and others by following the protocols set by the CDC and our state and local health departments. Please stay safe and be kind. I'm hearing just a little bit of an echo. Is anybody else? Oh, this sound is probably, you just mute the device. Yeah, remind me how to do that. Thank you. That's better. Always technology issues to deal with. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. I remind participants to mute your microphone when not speaking so as to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to be picked up, recorded, and broadcast for all to hear. We have here with us all council members, except for Travis Hoban, who is traveling and joining us remotely, and Bill Fillmore, who is not yet with us. This afternoon, the opening prayer will be provided by Councilor George Hanley.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this opportunity to meet and to strive to be of service to our community. We pray that Thou wilt bless us with wisdom and inspiration. We pray that Thou wilt bless this community. We are mindful that we are still struggling to get out of the pandemic, and we pray that Thou wilt bless those who are continuing to work on the front lines and help this community to get the medical services that they need so that we can continue to enjoy the opportunity to have life back as normal. We are grateful for our freedoms. We are grateful for this country and grateful for this community and all the good people in it, and ask for Thy blessings to be upon it. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those invited by the council may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the chair. Please wait to speak until called on by the council chair, and remember to mute and unmute your microphone as needed. First item we have today is approval of the minutes for the May 11th, 2021 budget work meeting and the July 6th, 2020 work meeting. Are there any objections or requested changes? Seeing none, I will declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent. First item of business is, and we welcome Councilor Bill Fillmore, who has just joined us. First item is a presentation on the quarterly report for the third quarter of the fiscal year 2021. This item was to be presented by John Borgen.
Okay. It's a pleasure to come present the quarterly report for the third quarter of fiscal year 2021, ending March 31st. And the purpose of the report is to give, it's intended to give an unaudited summary information to the reader about Provo City's revenue and expenses for the third quarter ending March 31st. The quarterly report contains data comparing previous revenue and expenses to current year's actual revenues and expenditures, along with a 5-year comparison. I have reviewed the expenditures and things don't see anything that's out of line, but I wanted to just focus primarily on revenues, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that the council may have. So if you go to page 2, this page really gives a good feel for overall revenues in the general fund. And normally you would expect, if we're according to budget, to be about 75%, because we're 75% through the year. There is some seasonality, but that's still a pretty good indicator. And you can see that we are at 88% through the end of March. And then it does show some areas that I want to just talk briefly about that are significant impacts to that. The first is sales tax revenue. We are at 80%, 87% of the budget. Our sales tax revenues continue to trend very positively. I would just mention that we now have our sales tax distribution for April as well, which would be 10 months out of the 12. And just to give you an indication, if we stay on the same trend, we will be almost 13% above the prior year and almost 18% above the budget. We expect to get the May revenue numbers from the state next week, but continuing to be very positive on sales tax. And you can see that both with sales tax and wrap tax. The wrap tax is all based on point of sale, where sales tax 50% is based on point of sale and 50% is based on our population. Another number that's up significantly is intergovernmental, and a component of that is the CARES Act money that we received, a portion of it, the amount that we received in this fiscal year, and so that's why it's up so significantly. You can also see our transfers are up. They're 81%. A couple of things that impact that with a number of our utilities, particularly energy and water, tend to be very seasonal with high use in the summer, and we have both July and August in this fiscal year, and so you would expect them to be above 75%, but still overall we're up. We're seeing that the energy fund exceeds the budget in the prior year, as well as our water fund. Both are related to hot weather and seasonality. But that still results in a higher transfer to the general fund, and so those revenues are going to be above budget. If you go to page 3, this just kind of shows some graphs that are helpful to give you an indication. Once again, you can see the general fund revenues that in the third quarter exceed budget and also exceed the prior year. The same with transfers in we just talked about. On page 4, you can see sales tax. It just graphically shows what we've talked about, trending very positively, as well as the recreation, arts, and parks tax. If you go to page 5, developmental services, which is our fees for building permits and all items related to construction in the city, been very positive, and we can see that it's well above the prior year and also above the budget. And as we budgeted for 2022, we planned on that to continue, and there's an expectation that it will. Our parks and rec fees, as you can see, they're through the third quarter, we're actually slightly below the prior year and below the budget, and that's primarily related to the rec center. And as you're likely aware, we had some restrictions during the year related to COVID-19. They actually were lifted for a period of time, and then we had to go back in and impose them again. And that just had some impact on overall revenues at the rec center. but we are seeing very heavy use and strong trends right now. And so we expect that going into next year that things will be positive. But we are going to come in slightly below budget for the rec center and for Parks and Rec overall. Franchise fees, not up significantly, but still positive from the prior year and this year. And a lot of that is based on our own utilities. There's a 6% franchise fee. We also have other waste haulers and commercial entities in the city that also contribute to the franchise fees, but positive. Justice Court, we're down fairly significantly, but I would just report it's one of the areas that I oversee, and we have had almost all of our restrictions lifted from the state courts, and things are turning back to normal, very close to what our pre-COVID levels are, and we hope and expect to see a more normal year in 2022. If you go to page 8, we have a list of our general fund appropriations this year. We do have some significant appropriations. Just one more slide. The first, we had about $8,889,000 that was related to the CARES Act funds. We moved 7.7 into the legacy CIP, and then we had our economic development and park CIP transfers. Just to mention, it doesn't show on here, but we received some of that revenue in the prior year, and then we received some this year. It was kind of mixed based on when we received it and how it came in and how it was spent. But so even though it's showing almost 9 million expenditures, we had intergovernmental revenue or CARES Act revenue to offset that. And so just be aware of that. And so that's the bulk of that. There was 614,000 out of the airport. $500,000 of that represented our payment for the property that was purchased adjacent to the airport. Then there was some money spent with some appropriated by the council for some incentives for the carrier to bring in new routes. So that's overall. Some of the other thing I would mention is down at the bottom, there's a $105,000 adjustment for a market study that was related to the fire department. And as you remember, they actually used their wildland money for that. And so it still comes out of the general fund, but it came from those revenues from wildland. New to this quarterly report, based on the council's approval of the budget resolution, there was a recommendation to include an update on the innovation fund. We could have started that next year, but I thought, we'll go ahead and include it. And so it's listed here. Dixon Holmes later on in this meeting is going to go through each one of those accounts and give you an update on those. But this is the summary, and this is what it will provide. These are all of the open awards. Those that have been fully spent from 2020 are not listed, but there are 2 that still had some money, and Dixon can give you an update on that. They're listed there, and then the rest of them were part of this year's awards. You go to page 9, library exceeded the prior year as well as the budget, so has a positive year revenue wise with the library, which is substantial. One of the things I would mention is that their largest revenue source is property tax, and because that comes in typically in November and December when it was collected, that's why their property tax numbers at like 101%, because it's very lumpy and it just comes in at one particular time. The golf course, I've got some exciting news with the golf course this year. I was talking to Scott Henderson, and I went back in and looked at, and some of the revenues that we receive, we know fairly quickly how we trended for the year. Others like sales tax and franchise taxes, there's some lag. But with the golf course, we pretty much know. And we actually came in over our budget this year. You can see our budget was $1.161 million. This is preliminary numbers, but about 30,000 over that number, which is substantial, because when you look at year to date at the end of March, we only had 552,000. And so that's exciting. The other reason that's really exciting is that, as you remember, the golf course was not complete until October. I think we had the grand opening in October. And so we were under construction, and a lot of things that were happening in July and August, which is our prime season last year. And so to come in this strong is just phenomenal. The other thing that's significant, most of you are probably aware, is in the 2022 budget, we budgeted a balanced budget for the golf course. We didn't have any transfers coming from the general fund. And I think as we look at the budget here and how we did this year, I'm pretty confident that they're going to be able to meet their budget next year. So that's a major mile mark. And I feel like that's a result of great management by the Parks and Rec and support of the council. And so I just think that's a significant amount of good news. The water fund, as we talked about, they're due to seasonality and also a little bit of timing. They're ahead of the prior year, and they're also ahead of the budget, which is significant. Wastewater, they're right at the budget. And as most of you know, with wastewater, it's pretty much not based on usage. It's more just based on a set amount that's collected each month. But the good news is that we're right at budget and where we'd expect to be with wastewater. Energy, as you can see, they are slightly above the prior year and even a little bit more above the budget, which is positive. And the other thing I would say is that a lot of our really hot weather came in June and July, and so that's not even showing in these numbers yet. This is just through the end of March. Question?
Yeah, I'm just remembering back to, I believe, the first slide where the energy transfers were significantly over the 75%, where here it seems like we're right at the budget. Is there a reason for that?
It looks like we're right at the budget, but we actually are above the budget. It's just their numbers are pretty large in the million, pretty significant. And so I think if we actually factored that in, even though graphically it looks a little like it's flat, there still is an increase there. And I think and I could even provide some information that would show that, but I think it should be tracking percentage wise the same. Okay. And then the airport, we are down from the prior year and down from our budget, not significantly, but we are down, and that's primarily related to just the impacts of COVID. There was a period of time during the year where we're even having less flights than we're having now. We're seeing a lot of positive things right now, and this last quarter has been better, but just because of this still goes back into that time period, and we're still down from the prior year and a little bit down from the budget. But very optimistic moving forward, the airport.
Mr. Borgen.
Yes.
Quick question. Above and beyond the impact of COVID, does the construction going on have an impact on our airport revenues?
I don't think so. It would probably be a better question to ask perhaps Steve, but I don't think so. I don't really think that's impact, because the terminal is so removed from where we currently have our operations. And so I don't really think that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Mayor, but I don't think so.
I would probably agree and say no, it doesn't have impacts. Okay, sanitation, we're slightly above our budget, but pretty much right on with the prior year in our budget. And then storm drain the same. And then our transportation utility, we're slightly below the budget, but it's tracking very close. And some of that might have to do with collections, but overall we're there. So it's kind of a quick overview, but I am happy to answer any questions from the council. If anybody has any?
Quick question. Sorry to jump around. A couple things. First of all, so on Parks and Rec, the main revenue source is the rec center on that line item.
It's a big piece. Yeah, the rec center is about 5 million, so it's a big part of it.
Yeah. So with the Orem Rec Center, with the extensions on memberships due to COVID, is there a projection at this point that will stay kind of light of budget for a while yet? I mean, I guess I don't have a sense of where we extended membership for free during the close time, how that will impact ongoing revenues, going forward, and then also how potentially attrition has occurred based on a new rec center in our, that's pretty close to ours.
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. I think the extension of memberships impacted last fiscal year more than this year.
I do feel like there has been some impact, with Orem and Springville's been open for a while now, but our sense, and I talked to Scott yesterday, our sense and feeling is that still feel that particularly on recent demand and where we've been with the rec center, it's been at capacity. And so we're still optimistic and expect to meet our budget next year.
Thank you. And then for the golf course, you mentioned some really good momentum. Do the current numbers reflect the transfer that we did to kind of make them whole as far as the numbers that had to be there? And is that if there is momentum and if there's a balanced budget for 2022, does that money come back to general fund, or is it part of the golf budget going forward?
So a couple things. The transfer is reflected as a transfer in, so it doesn't show as a revenue. So the revenue that we're showing, that is just operational revenues. That would be a council decision if they wanted to, if they generated a surplus in the upcoming year and established some fund balance and the council wanted to go back and move the money, that would be a council prerogative.
But the balanced budget projected for 2022 included what we already sent, obviously, as part of that budget for next year. Is that?
Yeah, that's just operational revenues. They estimated that the course would be open the full year. And so the revenues are slightly higher than where they were this year. But yeah, that's just operational revenues.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay.
All right, thank you, Mr. Borgen.
Thank you.
We'll move on to item number 2, which is a presentation on the South Utah Valley Animal Shelter's euthanasia techniques, presented by Captain Brian Wolken, Provo Police, Kirsten Munford, SUBES Director, and Michael Sanders, Council Intern.
Thank you. And thank you for allowing us to be here. First, I'd like to echo Mr. Harding's comments about the report that you received from Michael. I think it was very well done and also very fair and objective investigation on this. First, I'm going to ask Kirsten Munford to come up and speak about the animal shelter and how we euthanize animals there and the need for the euthanization that we do. Kirsten is the director of the South Utah Valley Animal Shelter, and she also worked at the North Utah Valley Animal Shelter for many years, combined for about 10 years. I also have Jason Swenson, our animal control supervisor here, in case you have any other questions that we can't answer as far as animal control. So, Kirsten.
Hello. Thanks for letting us come in and speak to you guys and hopefully better educate you on why we euthanize at the animal shelter, the need for it, and the way that we euthanize and why we feel that is the best way. For the past 8 years, these activist groups have been trying to pass legislation to make it so we cannot use carbon monoxide at the animal shelter for euthanasia. And now we know that they're starting to come at city council members with inaccurate information on how carbon monoxide works. The 2 reasons that we euthanize is to end animal suffering. So if they're injured or they don't have a quality of life, we need to euthanize them, and to protect the public. These would be vicious animals. They're aggressive, dangerous, feral, and so we don't want to be putting those back out in the public. And the reason that we feel that carbon monoxide is the safest for our staff and better for staff mental health is because it's less personal, and it's better for the animal because you're not handling them as much. So that's safer for the staff and the animal, because a lot of these animals aren't used to human contact or do not want human contact. For say a feral cat, I have a couple examples here. If we were to inject them, we have to net them, which stresses them out. Then we have to poke them with a needle to sedate them, which is also stressful and painful. When we do it with carbon monoxide, there's a box that stays in their kennel that they're used to for the time that they're there. We close it, move it to a different room, put it in the unit that we use to euthanize, and push a button. They don't know because carbon monoxide is proven that it induces loss of consciousness without pain, works without the animal understanding what's going on, so there's no fear, and is rapid, so they expire quickly. There's nothing illegal that we're doing. The AVMA backs us on it. Our veterinarian that we work with closely and is also on our board also agrees with us using carbon monoxide as a means to euthanize animals. He also agrees that it is better for our staff's mental health. We see a lot of people in this field, veterinary field, and also the animal field that have to do this task of euthanizing. There's actually a 5% or 6% increase to the possibility of suicide. So, I mean, it's not a task that we enjoy. It's not why we go into the business of working with animals. We don't want to euthanize them, but it's something that we have to do. So we just feel if we can do it the best way that's best for the animal and also best for our staff, that's what we'd like to continue doing. So. Any questions?
I just had a quick question. You mentioned the two reasons for euthanasia, the suffering and aggressive, dangerous behavior. What about strays that are just turned in? Do we have to euthanize many of those because they can't find a home?
We've not had to euthanize any adoptable animals since I've been at the South Utah Valley Animal Shelter, which has been going on 5 years. And when I was at New Voss, we didn't euthanize adoptable animals probably 5 years prior to that either. We work with a lot of fantastic rescues that help us, and we have outlets where we can adopt animals. We also have some animals that we keep at Petco in Spanish Fork for adoption. So luckily we've been able to adopt majority of them out. I think we're at 88% of our cats go either to rescue or homes, and 95% of dogs. So it's a small amount we have to euthanize compared to the animals that we get in.
That's isn't that kind of unusual compared to some other areas of the country? I've heard that there's areas where they have so many strays that they have to euthanize a lot. So
I don't think it's unusual. I think we've taken a lot of time and effort put into programs to be able to be where we're at today.
that's great. Thank you. Other questions, Mr. Henley?
Thank you for being here. Oh, whoops, I think I had it on the whole time. My light doesn't work. Thanks for being here and answering questions to help us get clarity. So is it true that you also have capacity for injections at your site?
We do.
You do?
Uh-huh.
And do you have any data or estimate as to like what percentage of the animals that you euthanize would be done by injection?
It's a small amount. If we have sick or injured like kittens, we can't use carbon monoxide, so we would use lethal injection, but also working with the veterinarian. If we get those animals in or those cases in that are injured, we get them to the vet. If he recommends it, sometimes he'll do it for us. So we're not tasked with that.
So that's the only reason you would use the injection is if it's, sorry, you said it was, if it was too small for carbon monoxide?
Yeah, if they're too young, it
Okay.
doesn't work.
Okay. And is that like a, I mean, I haven't visited your facility, so I don't have a sense of like how much space or resources you need to have in order just to have that as an option. Is that something that takes up a lot of your resources, or is it?
To do lethal injection?
Yeah.
I believe it's time consuming. And like I said before, the animals that we are euthanizing, unless it's like a kitten, if we had to, are dangerous. They're dangerous to the staff And the way we would have to do that with a dangerous animal, say it was a dangerous dog, we would have to get it on a catch pole and we'd have to pin its head in a corner and use something to hold its body to give it an injection instead of just walking it with a catch pole, which is like a long leash, but it's stiff so it keeps the animal away from you, into a unit where we can safely put it in there, which is less stressful on the animal.
So if you had, would you have the facilities to, and maybe you don't want to do this for the reasons you've suggested, but I mean, if there were an argument to be made that a wild or, feral animal needs to be euthanized with carbon monoxide, but the others could be done by injection, would that be, do you have any sense of what percentage that would end up being?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Strachan.
Got a couple, really one question for you, and that is, obviously you have a sunk cost, and if you were to do what the animal rescue folks, UARC would ask you to do, which is to convert to the other, what would the cost impact be for your facility?
I can't say for sure. I can't say it would be a huge cost. I think it would be more time consuming. So if you're looking at staff costs, I believe that would be an increase.
Okay.
This is more of a comment. I apologize, but I just wanted to say thank you for the professional work that you do. And I certainly understand that people do not go into this industry to hurt animals, but they do it out of a sense of love for these animals. And so thank you for the cost, the emotional and mental cost that people in your department forfeit in this kind of career.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have just a few follow-up things. I'll try to stay on time here. But as Kirsten said, the shelter adopts about 88% of all the animals that come in. The ones that have to be euthanized are the ones that are injured or can't be adopted. These aren't your fluffy little kittens that everybody wants. These are the wild animals, the feral cats, the animals that are injured that are going to hurt somebody if they try to hold on to them. So the Utah Animal Rights Coalition has been going to the various council meetings, and they have a petition that's been signed by thousands of people. Unfortunately, this petition is very inaccurate, very misleading. And the woman that wrote it is quoted as saying, "Dogs and cats in these chambers can take as long as 30 minutes to die, during which time they gasp for air and frantically try to escape." That is not true. The chamber that we use is commercial grade. It's a professional chamber, and it stays on for 16 minutes from the time we push go. The majority of that time towards the end is the venting of the system to make sure there's no carbon monoxide. The chamber's inside, but we also have several warning systems and fail safes and things like that to keep the staff safe. The scratching and gasping for air, I've witnessed this myself, the euthanasia in the chamber. I've never seen that. Kirsten's been doing this for 10 years. She's never seen that. The animal just goes unconscious and then slowly dies. Because of the way the carbon monoxide works, because it blocks the uptake of oxygen into the system, we use about, I think it's a 6%, the 6% in the system. So it's considered an insidious death. It's a gradual and cumulative effect from the carbon monoxide developing so gradually as to well established before becoming apparent. So the animal falls asleep, goes unconscious, and then dies painlessly. The AVMA, American Veterinary Medical Association, considers the gas chamber an acceptable condition or acceptable with conditions. And those conditions are for safety of the people more than anything else. And our system meets or exceeds those. And also the AVMA also does not say at any time when they're talking about euthanasia with carbon monoxide that it's cruel or painful at any time. In fact, Dr. Bott, who sits on the board, he couldn't be here today. He provided a letter. I heard that he had mentioned that the sedation that they give to animals before they give the lethal dose is actually fairly painful. And dogs will yip and cats will make noise and things like that. Even the Humane Society of the US said that carbon monoxide, when delivered in a properly manufactured and equipped chamber, is a conditionally acceptable method. That's the Humane Society. So what it does is it's not about euthanasia. What it is it comes down to cats, feral cats. Because if we don't have this available to us, as Kirsten said, and Cliff, you asked what the cost would be. Well, the cost would be more on the employees, because Kirsten has told me she probably won't have many employees that would stay there because they don't want to have to do this. But that's what the animal advocates want. They don't want these cats to be euthanized, and it's unfortunate. Dr. Bott, and this is in his letter, he said, my assistants, technicians, and other doctors all share in the physical and mental toll that providing this service takes on each of us. And he's referring to euthanasia, having to poke the animals. So it does take a mental toll that nobody wants to do. With the feral cats, we've already talked about the trap, neuter, and release programs and why we believe that those are a bad idea. Jason told me yesterday that if you drive out to the west side by the airport and the lake, there are feral cats all over the place out there. They've just kind of inundated that area. There's not a lot of homes and things like that. So they're affecting the wildlife out there, the ecosystem, and everything else. And I'll leave you with this. Kirsten had showed you our boxes. So this is the box that we would put animals in. We have larger boxes as well. They go in there, they get comfortable, then we place them into a larger chamber, and where they're put to sleep. The other one is a cat net. Again, these aren't Fluffy the little kitten. These are the mean cats that want to claw your eyes out. So this is a quote from the Utah director for the Humane Society of Utah. And it says, or she's quoted in the newspaper, to qualify as euthanasia or a quote good death, it's not good enough for the death to be just pain-free. It must be pain-free, stress-free, and fear-free. And I'm kind of curious how putting a cat in this and holding it down and poking it with needles is fear-free, pain-free, or stress-free. Cats go in here and they go crazy trying to get out of this thing. And now we're trying to hold them down and poke them with needles. I don't think that's fair to the animal. I think this is a much safer and much more humane way to put animals down. In fact, if it were my dogs that I love very much, if I couldn't do it this way, I would prefer to do it that way to watch them go to sleep. Any questions?
Mr. Hanley?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm curious what, in your professional judgment, are the reasons why injection is nevertheless preferred by all the organizations that I'm aware of? And my second question is, what has been the experience at other animal shelters in the state when they've made this transition to injection? Because we presumably have some point of comparison now to understand what has been the effect on the employees and on the rates and so on.
We do, and Kirsten can give you examples of that as far as in the state, what has happened. I can give you an example of when I went to another state. My father had a dog. He lived alone. It was a mean dog. It wanted to tear me up, and it was in a rural area, and I couldn't find a shelter or rescue or anything like that. I contacted the sheriff's department. They had gotten rid of their carbon monoxide chamber, and I said, what do I do with this dog? And they said, just got to take care of it yourself. And I thought, we could do better than that. And, we all can. But your first question, as far as my professional opinion about the injections.
Just why, I understand that things are overblown in this case, right? And I'm not persuaded by the most dramatic and negative descriptions of what carbon monoxide is like. But nevertheless, all of the major organizations express a preference for injection, and you haven't addressed why that might be the case. So I'm curious what you think is the reason.
My opinion is they don't want any animals euthanized, period. And they know that if the shelter employees or other employees have to hold these animals down and inject them, they're not going to want to do it, and they're just going to give up. And they're going to go to a trap, neuter, and release program, or just a release program where they're just going to let the animals go. It's unfortunate, but we do have to euthanize animals. But our options will be very small, very few.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Harney.
I wanted to echo Councilor Ellsworth's comments earlier and thank Director Munford and the other employees at her shelter for the services that they provide the community. Thank you.
Mr. Sanders, I guess you're up next.
Yeah. Mr. Sewell?
Yes.
While Mr. Sanders is coming up to the thing, Wayne shared, and Wayne, I hope you'd let me share what you gave yesterday. Wayne shared with some information with city staff. Just in context, about 2 decades ago, the city made the decision, or Utah County made the decision to consolidate the animal services into 2 different bodies, the north and the south. And so we've been operating under that system. They have an independent board, et cetera, et cetera. Our city's contribution to that is about $98,000 a year in terms of their budget. And just one other thing, I would tell you that we don't actually have any decision points here to make. This is really just for information based on some of the activities of different bodies the last couple of months.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Council. I'm just at the request of Council leadership, staff prepared a kind of comprehensive review of all the different literature, scientific and legislative, as far as animal euthanasia goes, by carbon monoxide and the injection. So just in the interest of time, I'm kind of going to speed through this, but I did prepare a memo that you guys have, and I'll be here available for any questions that you may have about it. So just kind of a broad overview of euthanasia. It means an easier, happy death, and it's from a Greek word. But when it comes to animals, it's really important that the method chosen to euthanize an animal needs to be balanced between the safety of the worker and the thing that's most humane for that particular animal. And that different state could really vary if it's like, as the police captain was saying, that if it is like a feral animal or like a nice fluffy animal, it really depends. Okay, so there are a variety of different euthanasia methods. There are non-inhaled agents, and that's the lethal injection. There's also inhaled agents such as carbon monoxide, or physical methods such as a gunshot or a penetrating captive bolt. And all of these methods that you see above you on the screen, these are all either approved or approved with specific conditions by the American Veterinary Medical Association. Okay, so just some quick facts about carbon monoxide in state code and federal code. So there's no federal standard for the use of carbon monoxide in regards to animal shelters. And state laws across the country are really mixed on whether or not it is allowed. There are 22 states with a complete ban on the use of carbon monoxide. 5 states have a partial ban, most of those being only allowing grandfathered in carbon monoxide euthanasia. And 23, including Utah, has no formal ban on the use of carbon monoxide for euthanasia. And an interesting note, there has been a bill introduced to the Utah State Legislature for the past 9 legislative sessions that has failed all 9 times, but it hasn't failed all 9 times because it has been defeated in both the House and the Senate. I think it was about 3 or 4 times it has been either passed in either the House or the Senate, but the legislative session expired before it could go to the other chamber to be voted on and brought to the governor. Okay, so just some quick facts from some studies that were conducted on the use of carbon monoxide. And just a side note, these studies are kind of few and far between because obviously it is kind of difficult to get a research review board to approve your study on killing animals. So there are very few of these studies out there, but on the ones that do exist. One of them found that dogs euthanized with pure carbon dioxide experienced a rapid cerebral death. Another one found that dogs do sometimes vocalize or will whine anywhere 20 to 25 seconds prior to unconsciousness. And in that study, they were not able to determine a cause for that vocalization or that whining, but it is not considered to, they do not think that it's in response to pain of any sort. And a videotape study observed that cats have little to no discomfort when euthanized with pure carbon dioxide. However, if it is a different gas, such as carbon dioxide mixed with oxygen, they do sometimes indicate discomfort. And they did do a comparative study between the different percentages of carbon monoxide in the chamber from 3 to 6%. And as you can see on the screen, the 6% carbon monoxide in the air is the fastest with 2-minute unconsciousness and 7.5 minutes till death, completing for about 9.5 minutes total time from beginning to end. And the 6% in the air is the standard set by the AVMA and also the percentage that the SUVAS does use inside of their particular chamber. And these are the official standards of the American Veterinary Medical Association in order to be, for the use of carbon monoxide to be acceptable. And as stated by Dr. Bott and Ms. Mumford, the SUVAS does meet all of these standards, mostly just, they mostly have to do with employee training and the industry standard for the chamber themselves. For injection, it's just employees use a single dose drug administered through an IV, which will compress the central nervous system and lead to unconsciousness and death. And due to the nature of the drugs used for this type of euthanasia, it's strictly regulated by the USDEA. As part of the studies for the IV, similar to the carbon monoxide, IV injection can sometimes result in vocalization or that whining that we heard of before, sometimes in excitement or gasping. But it does also, similar to the carbon monoxide, also result in rapid death, provided that the proper dosages are used. It can also be combined with an anesthetic. And this is by far the most common euthanasia technique in practice today and is considered by most, if not all, professionals to be considered the gold or industry standard. As far as cost goes, it's really split. I wasn't able to find much research done on cost comparisons between carbon monoxide and IV injection. I found one from 2009 from the National American Humane Society, who claims that the IV injection is cheaper, and they did include employee cost in their study. And a number of years ago, West Valley and Taylorsville, they did a study, and they claimed that carbon monoxide gas is cheaper. And interestingly, they did not include the cost of employee labor in their study. And right now, the North Utah Valley Animal Shelter is currently conducting an in-depth study on the comparative costs, and they expect their results to be out near the end of the summer. And I'm just here for questions now.
Mr. Fillmore.
I'm a little confused by the slide that references injection as the gold standard. Given all the contrary comments we've had before you stood up, is it the gold standard by the animal rights groups, or is it the gold standard for the veterinarian groups?
It's
given the danger to employees.
So it is considered the gold standard by the American Veterinary Medical Association. Also, so both veterinary groups and humane groups, they really advocate for the injection.
Why would that be, given the enhanced danger to employees?
I don't know. The reason why I would guess for the increased use of injection rather than carbon monoxide is because near the beginning of the 20th century in like the early 1900s and times of kind of old in the 1920 era when there was lots of animals that needed to be euthanized. They did primarily use carbon monoxide, but they would actually back up a truck to a box and just put the tail end of the truck in there to suffocate the animal with carbon monoxide. And that kind of led to the development of the injection. So I think that now they obviously don't do that. They use a pure carbon monoxide canister. And I think that developed alongside the use of injection. And I think that the injection just became the more preferred method by veterinary associations.
So I'm inferring that this apparent preference by some groups for injections has some historical antecedents with the backing up the truck kind of concept, or maybe it's a bit more barbaric. But it sounds from what I've heard that injections have greater potential for pain and stress and discomfort to the animal than the carbon monoxide. So I still don't understand why it is the standard.
Yeah, that information is kind of hard to come by, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm asking the questions that I was asking, because the reports that I read about why injection is preferred said nothing about, about the employee, the human element of it, but there's just too much uncertainty about what happens to the animal in the period that in between, the exposure to carbon monoxide and their death to know for sure everything that's happening to them. And there's such uncertainty and variance in terms of different animals experiencing it for prolonged periods of time. And so this one's immediate. And so it's deemed, at least all the literature I read, is it's deemed more humane to the animal. And that's by the veterans groups, veterinarians groups, as well as the animal rights groups. So that's why I was having trouble understanding. I mean, there's your report mentioned, about half the country bans carbon monoxide, but there's only 3 states, as far as I understand, that even have carbon monoxide. So even though it's allowed in the other half of the states, virtually no one uses it. And that's why there's so much focus on this particular practice in Utah County. Many other counties in Utah have already made this transition. So that's why I'm also not persuaded yet that we can't do this. This is going to, create some sort of crisis if we moved in this direction. And the option before the council is really, we can't dictate what other cities do, but we could request that they euthanize animals caught in Provo by injection, or we could say all animals caught in Provo by injection unless deemed feral. But to my mind, I'm not persuaded that there's like evidence that this is the right way to go, the status quo, that is. And I think there's good reason to believe that we could make this transition and be doing the right thing. So I'm willing to make that request of SUVAS if the rest of the council is. I don't know, Cliff, what you were saying earlier. I thought we did have at least a decision point on this at some point.
Well, I mean, the issue again, and it may vary from city to city. I mean, recognize again that I think the group last time went to Orem, which has a different form of government than we do. So with our separation of powers, we're not talking about legislation. The facility is not located in Provo. So we have an interlocal agreement executed between the city and SUVAS that places the responsibility for handling our animals on them, and by which we agree to the amount of money that we pay them. So the decision for the council, I suppose, is the council could issue a resolution requesting such a thing. It could request a review of the interlocal agreement to see if there is a way for Provo to drop out of participation and not use SUVAS for its animals. It could request, you may be able to, as part of your budgetary responsibilities, you could review whether or not there's a way to break the agreement in order to not pay the money to SUVAS if you don't like what they're doing with the money. You could request to the administration that they direct the one board member that is from Provo to advocate for that position or vote for that position on the board. But SUVAS itself is an independent and completely separate legal entity that we don't have any control over, other than that that as a city, we are a member of the organization and have a board seat that is appointed by the administration.
Yeah, I think I understood that. I just thought, I mean, you've outlined what I thought we did have an opportunity to make a decision about.
Yeah, so there's a decision point, meaning there's a decision point if the council wants to take a stand on the issue. There's less decision points as far as having outright control of the issue.
Right. I understand that. Thanks.
Councilor Ellsworth.
Who sits on the board?
Captain Brian Wolken is
Oh,
our
okay.
designated board member.
Gotcha.
Any other questions?
I just have a comment. Yeah, I just hope we can find Michael something happier to work on next time.
Yeah, that was a good report, Michael. Thank you. Councilor Harding.
I was just trying to find, quick search for answer for Councilor Handley about, I guess just with the question of if it's so traumatic and risky to do the injection, why is that the preferred method or recommended method from multiple agencies? And it looks like that's, I should have kept it up so I could read it, but basically for animals where there's that risk in administering would cause additional stress and whatnot, they recommend using the immobilization agents first. So they basically, sedate or whatever before they do that injection. So anyway, if that's of any help.
All right. Well, if there's no further questions, we'll move on to the next agenda item. And then I think it's in the ball would be in councilor's court if two or more would like to bring this back to consider some type of action. Thank you. Item number 3 is a presentation on technical findings from the Provo Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Oh, and by the way, I neglected to welcome Mayor Kafusi and Wayne Parker, who joined us much earlier, actually. Thank you. And this item will be presented by Mike Svets from Pros Consulting.
He's online. He's on our Zoom part of the meeting.
Joining us by Zoom.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if anybody has any preamble, but I can jump right into it. First off, I wanted to share a bit of news. You all are aware that the Provo Parks and Recreation Department is an accredited agency. And what this means is there's about 10,000 park and recreation agencies across the country, including armed forces. And only about 180 of those agencies are accredited as best practice agencies. But as we have found in working with Provo over the last 8 years, you all are not necessarily prone to resting on your laurels. So as an accredited agency, you have an opportunity to basically become the best of the best. And what Provo has done this past year is applied for what is called the gold medal. And there are different classifications based on population. And the Provo Parks and Recreation Department is a finalist in the class 3, which is population between 75,000 and 150,000 for the to receive the gold medal later this fall. So it's a huge step, and I think a huge congratulations are in order to Scott and his staff for the outstanding work that they do in terms of delivering park and recreation services to your residents. So Without further ado, I'll kind of jump into this. So as we presented to you previously, we presented the needs assessment findings. This information is a little bit more technical in nature and really want to focus on basically what we refer to as level of service standards and show you kind of where you're at and where you're going with regards to continuing to provide an excellent parks and recreation system to your residents. So next slide. So as I mentioned, we'll review very briefly park classification. We'll talk about level of service standards, equity mapping, and then proximity standards, and give you an understanding of kind of where we're at with regards to the project and next steps. Thank you. Next slide. So next slide. So from a park classification perspective, there's a park is not a park is not a park. And what we wanted to just kind of, again, briefly run through with you all is an understanding that, excuse me, different parks have different intentions or outcomes. And one of the key components to this is not just sometimes size. Sometimes we get hung up on large parks and small parks, but it's more about the intended length of experience. And neighborhood parks are typically a little bit smaller in size, but their length of experience is 30 minutes to an hour. These are considered to be very much one of the key backbones to a park and recreation system, as they're typically accessed primarily by neighborhoods that live around these neighborhood parks. Next slide. Community parks are what we refer to as, I affectionately refer to as neighborhood parks on steroids. These are parks that include more amenities, larger picnic shelters, could include sport courts, and even athletic fields. The intended experience, length of experience, is usually 2 to 3 hours, maybe even longer. They are larger in size, and the service area is also larger, meaning you typically don't have as many community parks as you do neighborhood parks. Next slide. Regional parks, these in your case are very much tucked up against the mountain range, and they are certainly intended to not just serve your residents, but also, as the name implies, serve outside of your geographical boundaries. Length of experience can be anywhere from 2 hours to all day, and these again are definitely larger in size. Next slide. Special use parks are exactly as the name implies. They are standalone special interest, special use parks. Golf courses, your shooting sports park are examples of these. And they're really, in many cases, designed to produce revenue to offset operational costs. These are not just usually parks that are used by your residents, but also, again, outside of your geographical boundaries. Next slide. And natural area trail parks, these are typically what we would refer to as passive parks. And the intention here is to not develop them as what we call active parks, but more to preserve ecological advantages to your community to having these, but also to provide those that are looking for a passive park experience. Usually the amenities are a trailhead associated with it and trails. Next slide. And then you have Greenbelt's trail corridors. This is certainly, as self-explanatory. These are linear swaths of land that are typically intended to carry trails. In many cases, these are consistent with any sort of bike ped master plan that you may have. And it not is just designed to connect to parks within your community, but also potentially destination locations within your community, or even connecting outside of your community. Next slide. So the next set of information we want to share with you is around level of service standards. And in layman's terms, this is really simply a matter of the number of amenities, the quantity of stuff that you need in your park system to meet community need based on the results of the community needs assessment. Next slide. So there are a number of variables, and I will not read all of this, but there are a number of variables that determine what we call population-based standards. So what a population-based standard is the number of neighborhood park acres that you need for every 1,000 people in your community, or how many basketball, or the number of basketball courts you need per population, or athletic fields. There are a lot of variables that go into this, such things as that can't be overstated is the prioritization of community need. But we also need to take into consideration financial sustainability, because it's not just about the money that you spend to construct any one thing, but the operations and maintenance dollars necessary to manage it year over year. Next slide. A couple of things that we do not include in population-based standards are natural area park acreage and trail miles. Natural area parks are really more about resource location and opportunity to acquire this typology rather than based on population. And trail miles is similar to a road system, is about creating a connected network. So it's not about trying to come up with, you could back into the number of miles that you need, but you're not starting to develop a trail system or expand your trail system based on a targeted number of miles. It's really about creating a connected network, as opposed to creating an arbitrary standard that says you need a half a mile of trail for every resident that lives in your community. Next slide. So this is your current park acreage. And so when we look at your park acreage, we're looking at your developed parks. You currently have about 800 acres of developed parkland, which gives you a current population of about, or a level of service standard of about just over 6 acres per 1,000. We're recommending, based on all of those variables, an uptick of that standard to about 7 acres per 1,000. And what this ultimately means is that over the next 10 years, not just based on your current population, but your projected growth, that you would be in need of an additional 270 developed park acres by about 2030. Next slide. And then we do the same exercise for your amenities. This kind of looks at athletic fields, sport courts such as basketball, tennis, pickleball, playgrounds, picnic shelters, off-leash dog areas, and then some special use items such as skate parks and splash pads. We don't identify level of service standards for every amenity in your park system just because it's not necessary. We're really looking at the things that are utilized the most by your community. So as you can see by the column to the very, very, very far right there, you pretty much have needs that exist with the exception of basically basketball courts over the next 10 years. Rectangular fields and pickleball courts seem like very large numbers, but I will explain that here in a second. So next slide. But what we wanted to do, and not just give you kind of these raw numbers, what we wanted to do was take into consideration what you have planned, but not yet done ribbon cuttings on. And so you have, in addition to your existing almost 800 acres, you have approximately 130 acres of parkland that is planned, but not yet developed or open to the public. So this, in a long story short, it reduces your need to acquire and develop parkland in the future. So before these planned parks and facilities were taken into consideration, the number of acres was 270 targeted for 2030. Because you're basically ramping up, you're going to have close to about 146 acres that are needed. The reason the numbers don't necessarily align is the fact that we had identified about 90 acres of special use park acreage, but in fact, you're developing 93 of that. So you still need an additional 146 acres in neighborhood, community, and regional parks. Next slide.
Could I ask a question on that real
quick?
quick?
Yes, absolutely.
So
You can go to the next slide. Previous slide, please.
Am I reading that right, that our regional sports park in here would be considered a special use park rather than a regional park?
Correct. We went back and forth a little bit on this, and we didn't want to create a category for sports complex. And so we really dialed it in to a special use park, because in essence, it is going to be a sports complex that really has active athletics within it.
Do we expect, I know that tournaments will be able to reserve the fields. Do we expect the public to be able to access it when there's not a tournament going on? And would that be fee-based, or would that be?
I believe that is, you're certainly looking at these as being game fields because of the level of maintenance that is going to be required to maintain them at what we would kind of call a level 1 standard, which in turn is really important to being able to host tournaments there, just simply because tournaments are always looking for, tournament directors are looking for high quality fields around which to use those. I would imagine that and I'm not sure if Doug and or Scott are on to help me with this, but I would imagine that there would certainly be some local use associated with these as well. My assumption is that they will be fee-based, though, simply because of the level of maintenance that is going to go into those.
Thank you. We made sure in the regional sports park design, even though the name, we call it the regional sports park, doesn't somewhat match these classifications, but it has numerous neighborhood park amenities. And it's even part of our management plan to leave some of the athletic fields open and available for neighborhood and citizen use as they practice. And so has a great walking path and playground amenities. It'll be a spectacular neighborhood park use also.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So next slide. So we went through and did the same exercise associated with all of the inventory that is planned in your future park development. And as you can see, a lot of those larger numbers drop way off with regards to such things as picnic shelters and playgrounds and pickleball courts and rectangular fields. So your needs for the additional acreage that we're seeking is really going to be centered around trying to create equity within your system from a geographical perspective, which we'll touch on next. But at the same time, recognizing that you're well on your way to meeting your 2030 standards, both in terms of park acreage as well as the active amenities that we've identified for a level of service. Next slide. I think it's important, though, just as I said before, that park systems, parks will have more than just the amenities that we've identified as part of the level of service standard within them. And so you may be thinking to yourself, well, if that's all the amenities that we need, why do we need an additional 146 acres? I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of open space, parking lots, restroom facilities, support facilities that will go into parks that will in turn make up the acreage, the difference in acreage that is necessary to support the amenities that we've identified in the level of service. So when we talk about level of service, we also want to take a look at it from an equity mapping perspective. And so what we've basically done is identified, you all did an excellent job. As we've said before, this is really a joint effort on this plan. And so the city's GIS department at our direction kind of created what you're going to see here from a mapping perspective. The idea is to identify the extent at which your existing and future parks are serving your population in terms of accessibility and equity. Now, we are using a population-based level of service standard to create these maps. And so, in essence, we identify and pinpoint on a map the park and or amenity, and then we basically extend in a uniform circle from the center of that park out until the number of people are served based on the level of service standard that we've identified. So again, these are based on population areas and how well you're doing in providing coverage. So you'll see circles that are shaded, and then the areas outside of those circles basically indicate that that those areas are currently not served by either that park type or amenity. Next slide. So from a neighborhood park perspective, you can see that where many of your neighborhood parks are located. A lot of them are located in southern Provo, but you also have many along the western edge of your community, as well as then up north. You can see a couple of new neighborhood parks in the yellow shaded circles being developed up to the north. And those certainly are going a long way to helping close some of the gaps, though there is some overlap associated with those as well. Next slide. So your community parks are a little bit more geographically balanced, and where we see the gaps in your system from a neighborhood park perspective, kind of in the center of town and even off to the southeast part of your community, you have done a good job of identifying those locations as community parks. So you can see also that there are a couple of community parks coming online that are in some cases overlapping what you're currently providing. But those parks will also have different types of amenities and experiences associated with them. Next slide. So a regional park perspective, as I mentioned, many of these are associated with access to the mountain ranges, and you can see most of these are tucked in and or tucked in up against and or in the mountains. The outlier here is Footprinters Park, which is in central southern Provo. Next slide.
May I ask a question on that before we move on?
Yeah.
I thought I was following with the size of the circle and all of that. Help me understand. We've got the Rock Canyon Trailhead and the park at Rock Canyon. We've got a large circle and then a smaller circle in there. Help me understand what that means.
Sure. Simply, what influences the size of the circles is twofold when we talk about park acreage. One is the actual size of the park, so the acres of the park. So the park at Rock Canyon is substantially larger in size, and therefore that circle is larger. Rock Canyon Trailhead is obviously is just a trailhead, so the number of acres associated with that park is less, and therefore the circle is smaller. The other factor that goes into determining the size of the circles, since these are based on population, is the population density around each of these parks. And so if you had, for example, if you had two parks that were the exact same size, and one of them was in a less densely populated area of your community, that circle would in fact be larger than the other circle that was in the more densely populated area. And so the premise here is to understand that a park can only handle so many people and handle so much usage, which is why in fact we wanted to look at it not just necessarily through the lens of the amount of park acres that you have, but also the population density around each park. Does that help explain?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Next slide. So special use parks, these are, as mentioned, your golf course, your future regional sports complex, the rec center, the ice arena, Covey Center for the Arts. Typically, we don't necessarily include indoor facilities, but because many of your indoor facilities also have park-like areas outside, it's not just a parking lot in a building, we included those as well. And so you can see that you've done a really good job of identifying special use parks. And I will tell you, for the size of your community, if anybody ever asks you what is unique about your park system, all you have to do is pull up this map and walk them through the different types of parks that you have that provide very, very, very different experiences. Many communities, I'll be honest, are very lucky to have two of these kind of parks. And you have, in fact, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of special use parks. And it's just exceptional, which is not just why you're accredited, but it's also because accreditation speaks to planning, but it's also why you're a finalist for gold medal, because this is just a superb example of the uniqueness and the richness of your park system. Next slide. So when we get into amenities, we're still talking population density, but the other factor that we're looking at when we talk about amenities is the actual number of amenities at any given location. So the same factor kind of holds true. If you have more diamond fields at a location, any one location, you would anticipate that circle being larger. And if you have less diamond fields at a location, you would anticipate that factor being the circle being smaller. And then the population density factor helps to kind of right size that circle based on how you're providing geographical coverage. So you can see that many of your diamond fields are either they're not up against the mountains, I guess is the best way to say it, and that's appropriate because the topography there doesn't allow for very flat fields. And so where you can put athletic fields, and in particular diamond fields that work with your topography, certainly you've done a good job of providing that level of equity. Next slide. So same goes with rectangular fields, and you can see how well the regional sports complex is filling in significant gaps in your system as it relates to rectangular fields. We took that yellow circle off, you would see a lot more white under there, and a lot more white than you have associated with your diamond fields. Next slide. So I'll start to run through these. I'm pretty sure you get the gist, but outdoor basketball courts. This wasn't a significant need in your community. And I think that your rec center goes a long way to help balance the need for outdoor basketball courts. And of course, your climate in such a way isn't always conducive to playing basketball outside for probably 5 to 7 months of the year. Next slide. Tennis courts, again, pretty good balance here associated with it. Again, tennis was not as significant of a need in your community as was pickleball. So on that, we'll go to the next slide.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
About the tennis courts? Are there going to be tennis courts at Slate Canyon? It is workable?
That is something that had been identified by staff as being a future amenity at Slate Canyon Park. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Next slide. So pickleball, you can see, obviously, when we did the plan back in the early 2010s, pickleball wasn't even really on the radar. You've done a good job of converting or adding pickleball courts to tennis courts, but your future is really about creating these standalone pickleball courts. And there's going to be significant number at the regional sports complex, also adding some at Slate Canyon, as well as Canyon Road Park in the future. So this is an example of how recreation trends have a tendency to change over time. And you're doing a good job of doing that. Small parks, small pavilions, pretty clustered in your residential areas. Next slide. And then your large pavilions are also fairly well distributed across your community. You can see a number of large picnic pavilions associated with your regional parks. Next slide. Off-leash dog parks. If I had to say that there was going to be a future need, it certainly is this from a geographical equity perspective. A lot of white there within your geographical boundaries. I can see probably in your future, if the land is available at the sports complex to add an off-leash dog park. Again, I'm not saying that there is, but this is probably an opportunity that you would capitalize on if that land was available at that future site. Next slide. Playgrounds, pretty well covered. Again, the regional sports complex is going a long way to helping close a significant gap there in the southwest part of the community. Next slide. And splash pads, again, this is really focused in the center. This is not a significant, huge need in your community, though you do have equity issues. It's certainly not something that you need to address significantly over the next 10 years. Next slide. And the skate parks, again, this is actually pretty good equity from a skate park perspective, especially when you factor in a future one potentially at Slate Canyon Park. Next slide. So the only thing that we wanted to kind of bring to your attention is, again, those equity maps are really based about population. And your GIS staff has actually started to look at this, look at access to parks in a different way. And so accessibility and proximity standards are something for you to continue to look at, not just based on population density, but more about the amount of time it takes for somebody to get to a park. Based on some of the preliminary mapping, you actually do have are doing a pretty good job in terms of meeting these kind of standards. Neighborhood parks, we really focus on walk-bike service area, so the amount of time it takes to walk or bike to a park, whereas community parks and regional parks, we're a little bit more focused on drive time. And people would typically ask me the reason why. Well, the length of experience there is typically longer, which means you're bringing more stuff with you. And most people are not going to walk 30 minutes or more with camping chairs and pop-up tents and coolers and athletic, baseball bags, soccer bags, and so on and so forth. So we really kind of approach it from both lenses, but kind of taking into the human element associated with which standard walk or bike or drive time is most appropriate based on park classification. Next slide. So we're really going to look to wrap this plan up here in the next couple of months. Hope to be back in front of you with a final adopted or a final plan for your consideration for adoption or approval, in the next couple of months. And at this time, I will stop presenting and see if you have any additional questions, concerns, comments, suggestions.
Any questions or comments, Mr. Fillmore?
So am I rightly assuming that when you come forward with your proposed master plan, that you will have some specifics in mind with respect to the Slate Canyon possibilities?
Well, we are not doing, the park plan is really about a system-wide plan, and really trying to look at where you have opportunities within your existing and future parks. But we are not doing a site-specific master plan. And so from a Slate Canyon perspective, what we will do is we can identify in narrative some of the elements that have the greatest, highest priority of your community. But again, that is going to be based on a much more dialed in process as to whether or not those amenities will be, number one, compatible with each other within a park, but also taking it a step further, topography and land use, and those kind of technical issues. So we aren't necessarily doing site-specific plans that are going to create renderings. However, we can identify in narrative the type of amenities that your community is seeking, and the compatibility of those within in particular that park. I will say we have had quite a bit of conversation in our virtual community meetings specific to that park. So I would imagine that once you unveil a site-specific master planning process for that park, you will get a lot of community feedback.
Any other questions?
I may sound like a broken record, but I sure appreciate the efforts to look at the geographic fairness of our system. I am thrilled to see these maps, and I think they will help the administration make data-driven decisions and can give the council and the rest of the community confidence that we're looking at things system-wide and doing our best to provide that fairness across the system. So I appreciate that very much.
You're very welcome. And I just want to reiterate, you all as a city produce these maps. So you have the ability to modify as population increases over time, or you add new parks, as opposed to them residing on the consultant side of the equation. So you're very much dialed into being able to update those, not every 10 years, but potentially every year, every couple of years.
Councilor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Harding, and I hope that we can develop these same kinds of maps for housing, for economic development, for the other issues that we work on, so that we can see a broader distribution and make better citywide decisions. And to Mr. Fillmore's question, and I'm sure Scott and Doug would address this better, but I believe that the Parks and Rec Department is initiating a process to create a specific master plan for Slate Canyon area with a professional landscape architect that would use like a community stakeholder group, as well as the data presented in this plan.
Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, I feel like it's been more than a month since I've said this, so it probably needs to be repeated. I didn't hear any mention of live music at the parks. Just want to throw that out there as an important use in our community, and I'm looking forward to a music festival at the new sports complex.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? All right, thank you very much. We'll look forward to progression of this plan. I'll just note, fellow counselors, we are about 20 plus minutes behind here, so we'll need to try to move along. Our next item is number 4, which is a presentation regarding the Westside Levee Plan. And this is to be presented by Brian Torgerson and Ben Rude.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Council. It's good to be here in person. It's been a while. I think there are some of you I've never presented to in person, so it's a pleasure. Just a few introductions real quick before we get started. Want to introduce Ben Rude. He's our project manager for our Westside Levee. I don't like the title of it. We're going to change it to study instead of plan, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But Ben Rude with CRS Engineers. Also in the back, we have Jared Penrod, our principal stormwater engineer, Mitchell Smith, one of our staff engineers, and then obviously Dave Decker, our public works director. Do I have control of the slides here? Perfect. Just real quick, I'm going to give an introduction and then turn the time over to Ben for the technical portions of the presentation. Sorry, Robert Mills. We also have Robert Mills with Community and Neighborhood Services. Robert is technically our floodplain manager, so he gets all the hard questions. So anyway, why are we here today? We're going to talk about our levee system. Many of you may or may not be aware that we actually have levees in Provo. We have, and when we say levee, it's simply an earthen embankment along the Provo River and along Utah Lake. This image shows where those are located. We actually have some up through the river bottoms area as well previously, but with the new modeling, those are no longer considered levees. So primarily from I-15 west along the Provo River and then around the airport, we have levee system there. Our levees were built in the 80s, obviously 83, 84, 85, pretty historic flooding in those years. So it's obvious as to why they were built at that time, to protect the airport and also farmland and such. To provide protection from flooding from the river and Utah Lake. Those levees are owned and maintained by Provo City. Even though they were constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 80s, those facilities are not, which this is kind of unique. Those facilities are not Army Corps facilities, which, like I say, is quite unique. And the reason for that, I guess, is because they didn't have time to do them right. And so they, I guess, knew what they were doing and ditched out on it. So just a little timeline again. Why are we here and why are we talking about levees? It all has to do with the modernization of the floodplain mapping that's done by FEMA. About a year and a half ago, Rob Hunter, who was the principal stormwater engineer at that time, gave a presentation on our levees in the river system. Many of you may or may not remember that, but just a little bit of history. Our levees, again, were constructed in the 80s. In 1988, the FEMA floodplain mapping, the FIRM maps, which stands for Flood Insurance Rate Maps, were authorized and approved by FEMA. They've been in existence ever since then. At that time, you can see the map on the left. The hatched area was an area shown to be protected by levees from the 100-year storm events, 100-year lake level, as well as the 100-year river level. When we would ever see that combined is beyond me, but anyway, that's what they study. So again, that's in existence today. However, back in 2007, FEMA and the Utah State Department of Emergency Management began modernization, which is essentially a remapping effort of the FEMA floodplain maps, the FIRM maps. At that time, we'll go back to a timeline. In 2006, they began it here in Provo. So over 15 years ago, that effort began. Since then, in 2007, we learned that FEMA no longer considered our levees as being effective in controlling floodwaters. So this is a point that I need to make clear. Our levees are functional. They do protect the city from flooding. They have for 35 years. In the eyes of FEMA, however, in their remapping, they ignore their existence, which is a bit frustrating. But in the mapping effort, that is the way. And part of it has to do back in 1995, some large hurricanes in the Midwest created some issues, and the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA, they kind of buckled down on their requirements for levees. One size fits all. Because of that, in 2011, this modernization project actually was put on hold and sent for congressional review. We didn't really, well, not just us, but a lot of areas around the country didn't necessarily agree with that one size fits all approach to levees, and the Provo River levees having to meet the same standard as the Mississippi River levees and the Gulf Coast levees and so forth. So project was put on hold for a number of years. That stalled it for a little bit. In 2017, they moved forward. In that modeling, they did determine that the Provo River flows that had originally been mapped were significantly higher than what we would expect. If you think about what's happened on the Provo River since the early 80s, we have Deer Creek Dam, Jordanelle Dam that function as flood control. So those are some of the things that have led to those flows and those projected historic flows coming down. As a result, again, some of those levees in the river bottoms areas are no longer required. They're not, those areas are just out of the floodplain at this point. Anyway, in 2019, preliminary maps for the countywide were approved or sent out. I think they're still working on a few minor issues on the Hobble Creek and some of the rivers in Payson, but we were successful in getting FEMA and the Utah State Department of Emergency Management to hold off on the areas in Provo. One, because we knew we had issues with our levees that would create some problems for us. Also, we asked them to reevaluate the historic high lake level of Utah Lake because that influences the flood elevation significantly. They're in the middle of that process now. Again, why are we here? Essentially with this remapping effort, our levees are shown to not be in existence on paper. Again, let me just be sure to emphasize they do provide protection. We don't see flooding. We don't anticipate seeing flooding, but again, this is a FEMA requirement, but because they were not constructed to FEMA standards, and Ben will get into that, they ignore their existence on paper, which again is frustrating. So anyway, here we are. We're about beginning of 2024. We anticipate preliminary maps, which will go out and shortly thereafter be approved, which means residents shown to be living in the floodplain will receive notice from their mortgage lender that they are now required to carry flood insurance, which that's really why we're here. That's really why we're worried about this, because it does impact our residents. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ben and kind of go through this. Let me just real quickly, you're going to see a few things here that may be a little bit alarming, but this is why I don't like the word plan. This is not a plan of action. We're not proposing a project. Nothing's been designed. This is actually a study that demonstrates what will need to occur if anything is chosen to be done, other than we do have an alternative to do nothing. But again, that impacts our residents quite significantly. So I want to make sure that it doesn't show up in the newspaper somewhere that Provo's planning on this project. We're not planning anything at this point. It is simply a study evaluating the levees and what needs to occur in order to make those certifiable. So yes, Mr. Fillmore.
Before you sit down, let me summarize what I'm hearing.
Okay.
This is a federally mandated exercise but technically speaking, you don't feel it's necessary. And it likely will impose significant insurance costs on our residents.
Yes, it is a federal mandate by a federal agency. They're the ones that control the mapping, which control the insurance rates. Now, that's Robert's area of expertise, is the insurance rate. So if there are questions as to insurance, I'm going to let Robert take that one. But yes, again, are we at zero risk for flooding with our levees? I wouldn't say that. Our levees, we know they were constructed with material that's not suitable for levees. Occasionally, every 2 or 3 years, we do have holes in the dike, so to speak, where we end up dumping truckloads of dirt in just to mitigate flooding. So is the risk zero? No, it's not. Is it 100% guarantee, which is basically what FEMA is saying? It's not. And so it's another one of these unfunded federal mandates, in my opinion. So,
Brian, given the fact that we're in a drought, have been for some years, given the fact that we now have 2 dams above stream, and given the fact that Utah Lake is lower than it's been for a long time, really a marginal utility with this exercise, but we have to do it.
correct. Again, if you look at the previous maps, they've been in existence since 1986. So these maps, once they're done, they're gonna stay there. With the digital world, who knows if they'll ever be completely redone as they are being done now. So they will be in existence for a very long time.
So when we get to the end, I'm sorry, I don't mean to monopolize this, but when we get to the end of this exercise, we have some decisions to make.
Correct.
Right? And because technically FEMA ignores the existing levees, we either shore them up at some expense, and I guess somebody's going to tell us where that money's going to come from, or we don't do anything and impose the insurance burden on our residents.
Correct.
Okay.
And that essentially, was the end of the presentation, but we are looking for some guidance from the council on where do we go from here, because there is, like I say, there are those alternatives to do nothing and wait for our residents to be impacted by insurance rates that could be pretty high. We don't know exactly what those are at this point because we don't know exactly. Anyway,
would it just be the residents in the area of the levees?
It is, and you'll see that's pretty much the whole west side of Provo. So anyway, let's let.
I just wanted to see the larger parameters of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So thank you.
So again, I hope you had the study in your material. I think we did include that. You can read through the studies. We simply just don't have the time to go through all of the details. But having said that, we fully anticipate this being ongoing discussion where we want to answer questions that you have and see that happening in future meetings. So with that, Ben, we'll go through the technical aspects of the study.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Nice to meet you all. And I'll just go through these slides and we'll talk a little bit about the levees and what our study found. So kind of the overall objective of the study, like Brian had mentioned, is first of all, where do we stand? Where do our current levees stand? Answer the question, can we accredit and certify those existing levees? And if not, where are we deficient? And then the second question is, okay, if we can't, then what are alternatives to get to the point where we have certified levees? And then the final is, what does that cost? And what are those funding resources that are available to help us make that an actual reality? So those are kind of the questions that we were presented with. So we looked at the existing levees. We dug into the levees. We did geotechnical borings. We looked at what they were made out of, when they were made. And this is the results of that analysis. We took FEMA's criteria, and that's over there on the left, and then compared it to 2 different subsets of levees, the river levees and the lake levees. They were built at different times using different materials, and so we kind of made that separation. You can see the river levees did not meet any of the criteria. The lake levees were sufficient in freeboard, which means they were built to an elevation that is satisfactory for FEMA's requirements. That's 3 feet above the flood elevation. And they are owned by the city entirely, the ones around the airport. So those ones, but the remainder of those, the most critical of which is the embankment stability. We found that the material that these were made out of was not suitable for levee construction. Like Brian had mentioned, they were built quickly in an emergency during a flood. They basically excavated rock out of the river and built the embankments next to the river to protect against that flooding that was happening. We took some pictures of our excavations, and you can see that the material that you want to build a levee out of is very fine grained material, silts and clays. And then you protect that material on the face with some larger boulders to prevent water from washing that material away. The materials we found when we excavated these levees was gravel and cobbles and boulders and roots and more roots. And so you can imagine that if you have a pile of gravel there and you pour water in it, water is going to go through the gravel. That's kind of the concept here, is that the levee material that they're made out of is not the right material for levee construction, therefore not meeting FEMA's requirements for embankment stability. And that's kind of what we found there. So with that being said, okay, what do we do now? Where do we go? What's the alternatives? We set up an alternative criteria matrix and basically said that these are the priorities for evaluating alternatives. We're going to look at flood risk prevention, environmental considerations, recreation, property acquisition, and costs. And we started really large. We looked at flood walls. We looked at sheet pile walls. We looked at all sorts of types of potential flood prevention mechanisms that we could use with these levees, and then kind of narrowed it down to those alternatives that we actually felt were feasible along this specific corridor, and came up with 3 main alternatives that we evaluated. The first alternative is reconstruct the existing levees in place on their current alignments. Alternative 2A and 2B came out to be setback levees, which is basically build a new levee on the outside of the existing levees, set back from the river, and leave the existing levees in place. 2A and 2B have some minor differences in their alignments based on property acquisition. You can see those alignments here. So alternative 1 is the pink, which is reconstruct the levees in place. 2A and 2B, green and blue. The setback concept, you can see where the alignments deviate for 2A and 2B. The setback concept there, in order to achieve that, you would have to take those additional homes, which is what resulted in the 2B alternative. So here's some cross-section depictions of what those levee alternatives look like. So the top one cross-section is our existing levee scenario, which shows that we've got the levees directly adjacent to the water, the channel, right there in the center of the cross section. And then there's some open space, and then you've got the residents kind of outside of that. Our alternative 1 is to replace those levees in place, which means bring them to up to standard. And the key difference there you'll notice is the vegetation. So in our existing condition, we have nice trees along a trail, and those trees provide the shade and the recreational access. Well, trees and levees don't get along. You can imagine if you have roots that make their way through the levees, and then the tree dies and those roots decay. Now you've got a hole in your levee. That doesn't work. So FEMA requires 15 feet of offset from your levee. It's kind of a vegetation-free zone. You can have grasses and stuff like that, but no woody trees or large shrubs. So the big change there is, if we put the levees back where they are, we got to get rid of all the trees along the trail and kind of change the aesthetics and the recreational use of that area. The alternative 2A and 2B are the ones shown on the very bottom, which is our setback levee concept, where we would leave the existing levees, the trail where it is. We would build new levees outside of that and acquire the property associated with building those new levees. And then we would have our vegetation-free zone outside of that main river corridor, which is where a lot of the trees exist currently. We looked at the lake levees. The alternative there, because the city owns that property and because there's not really a way to do a setback levee into the lake or into the airport, we just looked at reconstructing those levees in place. That made the most sense. financially and from a project's perspective. So on this map, basically that green line all the way around the airport is our alignment for reconstruct those levees in place. And that's basically what that cross section would look like. The top is the existing, where we've got some trees, mostly bushes along the levee. We would reconstruct those in place and then remove the vegetation directly adjacent to those levees. With that, after we evaluated our alternatives, established what those were, we did a cost benefit analysis to look at, how do these stack up? Is it worth it? And on the benefit side, the flood reduction, the removal of the insurance requirements, maintaining property values and allowing for land development. On the cost side, it's the engineering costs and construction costs of the proposed or the studied, I don't want to say proposed, but they're not proposed, they're studied alternatives, right of way, environmental impacts, and then some funding resources. So the do nothing alternative, what if we do nothing? What does that mean for the residents of Provo? What are the risks of that, of uncertified levies? So I've listed most of those here. FEMA flood insurance requirement is the big one. We've estimated that to be $600 to $6,000 per year per home that's in the floodplain. And that varies obviously depending on the depth, your proximity to the river or the lake, the depth of the water at your specific residence, and then whether you have a basement or not, where your finished floor is compared to that water elevation. Flood damage risk assessment, we looked at how many homes are in the floodplain. We did a comprehensive analysis of what the total damage would be during that FEMA proposed 100-year flood event. The other risk is substantial damage, substantial improvement. If we don't have certified levies and there is a flood, the homes that are flooded, you can't rebuild the same home they had. They basically have to bring their home up to standard, which means they have to elevate their home above that flood elevation, which you can imagine could be a big impact to people with basements. If you're having to fill in your basement and rebuild your home higher, that's a big change to the property value. So, and then property values in general, knowing you're buying a home in a floodplain is something you think about when you're going to buy a home. And then land development. Right now, there are restrictions in place on developing in the floodplain. Those obviously, we would have added requirements for developers who wanted to develop within this floodplain. They'd have to get special approvals through the city and through FEMA in order for them to develop correctly. So that's a do nothing alternative.
Sorry, could I ask a quick question? Yep. It's actually the previous slide before you keep going, or maybe it's the one before that. You were talking about, this one. The levees I'm familiar with that are, I think, part of the lake levee. I mean, they're covered on both sides by enormous trees, right? When you talk about taking away vegetation, these are those enormous cottonwood trees that we love. We'd have to take all those out just to improve the levee.
In order for you to have a certified levee, now we're talking certified levees by FEMA.
Yeah.
Yes, you cannot have trees within 15 feet of the toe of the levee. So you would have to rip all of those out on both sides.
Oh,
yep.
Yeah, the one by the airport's a major birding area. It's a beautiful
environmental impacts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. For sure, that's a consideration that goes into this whole thing is recreational impacts and environmental impacts. So this is the flood damage assessment. You can see here, we looked at every residence that's in the floodplain and we put dollar values to how much damage they would receive in their homes, as well as some of the more critical facilities like schools and churches and the airport, and put dollar values to that to come up with what that benefit cost ratio would be. In terms of a summary here of our benefit cost analysis, so our different alternatives, I wanted to provide you with the table of the number of parcel acquisitions, partial and full parcel acquisitions that would be associated with each of these alternatives. So alternative one, rebuild the levees in place. The levee, the land the levee is currently on is not entirely owned by the city along the river. And so for us to meet FEMA's requirements, we have to be able to maintain and establish that levee and establish ownership along that levee. So there would be 58 partial parcels and 2 full parcel acquisitions in order for us to acquire that land. 2A, the setback levies, and 2B, the setback levies, 93 partials and 9 fulls. And you can see the dollar values there we've estimated. 19 full parcels on the alternative 2B, which was that little sliver of alignment where we want to set back the levee. There's 10 parcels in that little space that make the difference between 2A and 2B. So down to the final summary of the estimated project costs. This goes into our benefit cost ratio. So you can see, let's run through alternative 1. The estimated project costs are $74 million to rebuild the levees in place for both the river and the lake, all included in one total. That includes the property values above. And then the estimated total flood damage assessment cost is $109 million. So you've got a benefit cost ratio of 1.46. And then similar for 2A and 2B is how that benefit cost ratio is calculated. The do nothing alternative, we can't actually tell you, well, you're going to have $110 million in flood damage because we don't know when the flood's coming. But that's the basis of the analysis was, what is the total cost if FEMA's flood is accurate and it really happens? That's that $110 million. And it includes insurance costs for the next 50 years is what we base that on.
Can I ask you a question about that table?
Yep.
So you're saying that if we were to, for example, select alternative 1, we would be paying $74 million, but we would be avoiding the cost of $110 million.
Yes and no. Yes, the first part, $74 million would be the cost of building that project. Can I guarantee you're avoiding $110 million in flood damage? No. That's just the projected flood damage from the 100-year FEMA flood event, if that were to happen.
That's a projection, an estimation.
Kind of a projection, kind of a what-if scenario. If that happens, how much damage do we receive? What is that total cost? And that is how, so all of this leads into the benefit cost ratio is very important in funding resources because FEMA grants and RCS grants want to know, what is your benefit cost ratio? If we're going to give you a grant for this, what is the cost and how much benefit do we get out of that? So we want to show that number greater than 1 or else the project doesn't make sense. And so this is the method that FEMA lays out for establishing that benefit cost ratio is what we followed.
I have 2 more questions. Sorry. One is, I think it was right after 1983, Great Salt Lake, they built a massive multi-million-dollar pump system. It's out in the desert now because there's no water anywhere near it. It was a complete waste of money. And I'm wondering, and part of the reason is because it seems to me they didn't calculate anything about drought conditions in the American West, which are getting worse. And Salt Lake's about to disappear. So are they factoring in not only the dams, but the fact that we're getting less and less snowpack every winter? Are they taking into consideration climate patterns at all?
So I didn't do the FEMA study, so I can answer what I think, but so my knowledge of what FEMA considers is they base their hydrology or their analysis of how much water comes down the river based on gauge information. So they look at the gauge that's I think it's at the state park or Geneva. It's just upstream of Lakeshore Drive is where the USGS gauges how much water is in the river at any point in time. They take that data and they process it through an analysis to say, okay, in the last however much data you have, these are the peak flows in the river. They look at when the dams were built and say, okay, post dam construction, this is your statistical analysis based on the flows in the river. This is what your 100-year flood would be in the river. So it's data that has happened, not necessarily future climate change projections. It's very hard for them to base flood insurance and make people pay flood insurance or not pay flood insurance based on future projections. It's easier for them to base it on what has happened historically and data they have.
Right, which is a fundamental weakness in the system.
Yep.
Is this, have we exhausted all of our congressional help on this?
That is not for me.
So that's one of our questions at the end of this, right? This project was stalled for 3 to 4 years, going through Congress once. We've threatened that, I guess, lightly with FEMA, and the response was, well, do your worst. This has been looked at before. So that is certainly an alternative. And if that's where the council wants us to go, we'll certainly look into that, but it has been done. I guess that has been tried already for 4 years in Congress. So that's an option.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Yes.
So this is based on a study. What year was it concluded?
The FEMA study,
Yeah.
or the levy study?
Both.
Both. The FEMA study, I believe they delivered some conceptual maps to the city last year in November timeframe. So that would be when their mapping kind of was to a point where they shared it with the city. They haven't gone preliminary or produced maps officially for city review or for city, official comment. And then our study was concluded in May of this year.
Okay. And so this program, I assume, applies to all 50 states.
Correct.
Is there not a massive outcry throughout, at least throughout the West?
I would say yes. Again, it's relative to levies. I don't know how many locations in the West have levies. So again, it went through Congress for 4 years.
River, right?
Right. Well, potentially, we have a lot of deep canyons in the West, right, which kind of precludes the need for a levy. But I just want to make sure I understood your question, Mr. Fillmore, about the data.
I want to know what this is all based upon data-wise.
Yeah, so the data, as Ben indicated, the hydrology that FEMA use is a historical data. It's historic rainfall data, all the way back to the beginning of recorded data, as well as the river and lake level data. They went back as far as they could, where we had recorded data, and they used that as kind of the basis to determine the 1% chance storm that then contributes to the runoff that produces this hypothetical storm, lake level combined to, so it's historic. And gosh, I think we're back to the 20s, maybe even.
I think there's close to 100 years of gauge data at that gauge.
So is it weighted? Is the data weighted in terms of the most recent, say, 10 years?
It's not really. There are fluctuations up and down, but the way the statistics go, it's really just a percentile, really, on how that's determined.
So I'm assuming you fellows have discussions with your counterparts in other cities here in Utah.
Yep.
Who are our primary companions in distress on this particular issue?
Springville, Salt Lake County. They have the same issue around the Salt Lake Airport and their surplus canal. They're dealing with the exact same issues. They're a little further along than we are because their remapping effort started much earlier than ours did. So they're a lot further down the road, but they're feeling the exact same pinch and having to comply with the exact same standards and requirements that we are.
Does the federal law have any exemptions or appellate processes or where you can ask for a deferral or exemption? Are you aware?
Well, I think we've done that. Like I say, it's been 15 years and we've kicked the can down the road for 15 years, stalling and waiting and trying to look at dam operations to see if they could account for, if we did have a levee breach, could they shut down Deer Creek Dam? Unfortunately, FEMA that had to be written into the dam operations manual in order for them to accept that. We met with the Department of the Interior, the United States Bureau of Reclamation. They weren't necessarily willing to do that. So I think we can say, Wayne, we've exhausted everything that we've thought of to be able to kick this down the road a little bit. And
we're just now, we're there, right?
We're there. We've, like I say, we teamed up with all of the cities and the county, requesting that FEMA study the lake again, which was a pretty monumental undertaking. They agreed to do that with the support of all the cities. That was at our request, Provo City's request. So they have spent the last 2 years reevaluating the historic lake level, which was not anticipated previously. We've sent numerous letters to the Department of Emergency Management, stating our disagreements with the process, getting responses from FEMA that this is the way it is. Sorry, this is well within their regulatory authority. And so right now, like I say, we're at a point where we have to make a decision if, are we going to do something to try and meet those regulatory requirements? Are we going to do nothing and face the implications to our residents of what that means? And so, Ben, I think this was close to your last slide, right?
Yeah.
So we'll wrap up, but some of the questions we have is from you as a council is, how would you like us to proceed?
So one last question for me, if I might. So are we being held to the same regulatory standards as communities along the Mississippi and New Orleans?
As far as I'm aware, we are.
It's not regionalized in any way, shape, or form.
It's not based on magnitude of, I mean, like I say, the Provo River compared to the Mississippi River is, but we are held to the same standard, which is, again, what was fought in Congress about in 2000, what was it, 2015? No, 2011. So yeah, that's probably the hardest pill for me to swallow is there's no, yeah, it just doesn't seem equitable in that regard.
It's the classic example of one size misfits all.
Well, holy Hannah.
So again, we don't anticipate being able to answer all of your questions today. We don't anticipate you having all of the questions today. Really what we want some general direction. First of all, is what general direction can you give us? What additional information would be helpful? Again, to your point, Mr. Hanley, should we pursue anything from an elected official standpoint? Do we contact our congressmen and our representatives? Do we go ahead and get started on an environmental process to move forward with a design and actually come up with a plan that we move to construction? Obviously, depending on availability of funding. And then what are some things that we should consider? Are there alternatives, specific alternatives you just want us to steer clear of? You mentioned the trees. That one's taking out and denuding the entire bank of Provo River from Geneva Road clear to the airport. That's going to be a tough pill for everyone to swallow. Is that one you just want? Again, these are just examples of things that we need some feedback from you as a council on. Are there alternatives that we just dismiss at this point and don't even consider any further? Again, we only have 3 alternatives. And let me just say, as we move forward, assuming that we do at some point move forward with the project design, that ultimate design could include bits and pieces of all 3 alternatives or none of these alternatives. Again, this is a pretty high level view. When we get into engineering design, it could include a number of different options. We could have flood walls in some areas. We could have, anyway, I just want to make sure that that's clear. We've evaluated 3 alternatives. That's not necessarily what we'll, if we end up going down the road to take measures to to certify the levies, it may not look exactly the way we've outlined it here. So
I assume the numbers you've given us probably don't take into account if we're going to denude the levees all the way down to the lake. They probably don't take into account reforestation cost, putting in new trees.
well, and
Or
see,
for that matter, parks and rec alternatives for trails and.
well, so Mr. Fillmore, here's the heartburn is we'll take them out, but we can't put them back.
Or simply can't.
We can't. That's the whole, one of the criteria is that trees cannot exist on the levee.
Problem.
And so, yeah, exactly. Even large shrubs can't exist. We're talking grasses and anyway, so yeah, it's a pretty big hit to that corridor.
Do you have a trailway on top? I mean, for maintenance purposes or
Yep, that's required. And if you let
runners and whatever.
Yep. So that's why we went to alternative 2, right? Is we suppose that would be a hard pill for people to swallow to denude the entire Provo River. And so that's what alternative 2 does, is that allows you to keep the trees, you keep the trail as they exist today, and you build levees further back. That's just more impactful to residents, obviously.
Mr. Harding.
We were talking about federal mandate, federal regulations, kind of loosely there. I don't imagine, it's not a federal mandate that we build these levees, correct? It's just, I assume the mandate is that if we don't have certified levees, they'll create these maps, flood maps. And is it all mortgages that are located there, or are they just like the FHA, those type of?
Yeah, they're federally backed mortgages.
Okay, so anyone who has a federally backed mortgage would need to pay that insurance.
Correct.
And so if a home was to be sold in the future, someone could either get a federally backed mortgage and know that they would have to buy the flood insurance, or they could go with another option. They wouldn't have that requirement, but they do have.
Correct. There may be banks that require it anyway, even if it's not, I don't know.
Yeah.
Again, I would suspect that if it's mapped in a floodplain as a lender, you're going to want to make sure that those insurance required. So
On the map, the lake levee, it looked like the current one wraps up to the north, and on this map, it looks like it stops at Lakeview Parkway.
on the south side.
On the south side, yes.
Okay, so with our study, we have accounted for our development requirements that we are requiring developers to bring up the land to up and above the flood elevation of the lake. So that's why you see the regional sports park, for example, the levee goes right down the middle of the regional sports park. That regional sports park is being brought up above the flood elevation. And so the need for those levees on the west side, we're saying development's going to take care of those areas because they're going to bring in the fill to bring them above the flood elevation. So that at that point, they're protected from the lake. Then we just have to worry about the flooding from the river, which coincidentally is actually more impactful than the lake.
Okay. With that development, these are questions that I'm sure you've already looked at, but just it seems like I'm just wondering if by doing that, I mean, does the lakeside levee now basically just exist to protect the airport because it seems like that the lake is less of the concern.
Yeah, so it does protect the airport, but if you look at the first map, sorry, I'm going to buzz back through these. You can see that lake elevation. Ben, do you have your laser? So that's the lake elevation line. You can see our airport's not even on our map. So it does impact more than just the airport, Dave. It's pretty good portion of the west side of Provo, just of the lake. Now, Lakeview Parkway, it will certainly act as a levee. It has penetrations for drainage, obviously, but it's not even built to levy standards. So
And so this map, basically, even though the levee doesn't wrap to the north as far as it does anymore, it's still shown as flooded, and that's because of the water theoretically coming through the airport rather than up and around from the south.
correct.
Okay, thank you.
And the river also, right? So Ben, show them the hatched area.
Right.
So all of that hatched area is actually a result of the river. Again,
Okay.
the supposed flooding from the river.
And then the final question I have is the 110 million. I think I heard that, just trying to figure out how we got to that. It sounded like that included 50 years of insurance costs, that would be paid by the residents. The residents would pay insurance costs for 50 years. And then after that, we had a 100-year flood and it caused a whole bunch of property damage.
To all of these dots on this map, there was a price tag, based on the depth of flooding, right? And a dollar value is assigned to that, and it's an estimate, obviously.
Yeah.
But again, that is if the FEMA storm occurred or FEMA event occurred.
Yeah.
And so it's probably a little artificially high. Because again, our levies do function.
Yeah. I'm also wondering, are we double counting? And I imagine there's federal regulations controlling all of this, or guidance or whatever. But it seems like we're counting the cost of the insurance, but then we're counting the full cost of the disaster. And if we are insured, then it seems like the insurance would be paying for the disaster, reimbursing that. And so it's like we're counting the premium cost, but then we're also counting as if we're not insured.
Yeah, no, I understand the question. Yeah, it's kind of confusing, right? But the basis there is FEMA wants to know, because at the end of this, right, FEMA foots the bill for if you're in the NFIP program and you have an event and these people are covered by insurance, they want to know, okay, well, how much is it going to cost the residents to pay their insurance? How much is it going to cost us to fix the homes on the insurance, the actual flood damage side? And they want to see both of those numbers added together to develop that benefit cost ratio. Because if we do a project and we certify these levies, we get rid of insurance and we get rid of flood damage. Therefore, weighting our costs against both of those, not just one or the other. But for the residents, yeah.
But they're taking the dollars paid in premiums, and that's what they're using to cover the cost of those.
An important thing to keep in mind is the National Flood Insurance Program is federally subsidized. So you receive a break on your insurance premiums because it's being subsidized basically by FEMA.
Okay. And then let me just state one thing, and then I'll be quiet. But it seems to me that $110 million is public money. No, sorry. Let me say that. I got it backwards. The $50 to $75 million price tag that we're talking about is public money, taxpayers' money, and the 110, which is a lot of, it's both insurance as well as a potential if one of these things happen and we have no protection from our existing levies or whatever. But that is more private money, not necessarily the public money. It's not taxpayers' money from that perspective. And so,
Is that right? What he just said?
Yeah, so if Provo City takes on a project, then yeah, that would be public money that would fund a project, right? Whether it's federal or local or state, whatever money comes.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, you're correct that insurance would be paid by individual residents. And then if a flood event happens, then that insurance would pay, those damages would be paid by the insurance company, which most likely will be the federal government that's offering us NFIP, federally subsidized insurance. And so FEMA would come in and pay those claims.
Okay.
Which is
okay. I'll leave it at that. I have some additional thoughts on that, but I'll leave it at that just as the council considers these things in the future. I really appreciate this presentation though.
Mr. Strachan.
Yeah, just, it sounds like we're going to have some more conversation on this far beyond what we've got scheduled for today. Mr. Hoban has a question. I don't know if he wants to ask it or if I can read it directly.
Go ahead, Mr. Hoban.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right. Sorry, there will be some background noise. I'm sitting in an airport. My question was, what are the legal implications? So if we don't bring the levees up to standard and there is a flood, the city is sued for neglect or, being negligent in that. And then another idea would just be if we wanted to, if our concern is, well, I guess at this point, are citizens right now paying flood insurance that are in these areas?
Mr. Hoban?
Or are they not?
Mr. Hoban, you're kind of breaking up. It was hard to understand. Did you already send your question to Mr. Strachan? I'm wondering if we can have him read it for you.
Yeah, I'll ask my questions offline at another time. Thank you.
I think I heard one, what is the liability if we choose not to do anything and there is a flood event?
Okay.
I think, Brian, you can help me out here, but I'm sure there would be a possibility for claims against the city. I think no question, whether they're successful or not.
Well, in some ways, it's almost the flip side of trying to, it's a complicated issue because here's the problem is that generally speaking, the city has complete discretion to do things or not do things. And if they choose not to do something, they're generally not liable for having not done it. Where the problem comes in is if you choose to do something and you do it wrong, then you're liable. So in some ways, it's depending on the way you think about it, it might create more liability to fix the levees. In the sense that if you fix them, if you undertake to fix them, but then you don't fix them right, or you don't fix them to standard, or you fix them but don't maintain them, then you've probably created a liability. Now, the flip side of that is that these levees already exist, but if FEMA goes ahead with this process and decertifies them, and we say, and we go along with that and say, we agree there's no levees in existence, then we probably don't have any liability for somebody that's flooded because there's no levee there. Is kind of a quick take on it, but it's a complicated issue that there's a lot of stuff to go into. So we probably need to talk about that some more.
Yeah. And then one other, Mr. Hoban, I think I heard one other, the question was, are there residents paying flood insurance in Provo now? There may be a few in very localized areas, but we're talking just a handful, if any, because the area shown on our maps is currently under the existing maps shown as protected by levee. And so they're not paying flood insurance or not required to pay. Some may choose to get flood insurance, but they're not required by their lender.
My suggestion, Mr. Sewell and council, is to work with the administration and as you make progress on things like funding the options and things like that, that we bring it back to a council work session when they're ready.
Okay, I think we're going to have to do that. We're quite a bit behind here. In fact, I'm wondering, yeah, let's do that. We'll continue this and
certainly welcome any email comment of, and then we can dive into this a little bit deeper and get back to you.
All right. Thank you very much. It's an important question. We're scheduled to take a break now. Let's take a 10-minute break or 8 minutes. Be back here at 4:10. And then we got to figure out how we're going to get caught up. We have someone coming in at 4:30, don't we? It wasn't there a presentation on the Delta River? Okay. We'll probably have to rearrange some things.
Are all your people, are you the only one presenting?
Okay.
I think we can fit it.
All right. We'll see you in 8 minutes.
The recording has stopped.
Technical difficulties again that delayed us just a little bit. So we're going to go ahead with item number 5 and 6, and then we'll jump to item number 8, since we have guests planning on being here at 4:30, some of whom are already here. So go ahead, Mr. Strachan, a discussion regarding a Municipal Council Handbook Amendment.
All right, thank you, Chair Sewell. So one of the results of the pandemic was that we got really good at doing Zoom meetings. And as we've contemplated coming back to full in person, there's been a desire to continue to have Zoom meetings, or at least as an option. And anecdotally, a conversation I had with some peers in another city, there was a desire by some not to come back to council meetings. And not that we've had that issue here, but we thought in talking at leadership that we should probably make a little change in our handbook meetings, or electronic meetings section of the handbook. Currently under state code, the city council has adopted a policy enabling attendance by electronic means. And in the past, that's always been by conference line. Sometimes you'll hear the voice from above talking in our meetings that usually council members called in while they've been traveling for whatever reason. So we just wanted to add additional language to be added to make it clear that in-person attendance is expected. This is the existing electronic meetings policy of the city. What we propose to do is to add another paragraph that says this: it is the expectation of the municipal council that each council member should regularly attend regular and work meetings in person whenever possible, and participate by electronic communication only when necessitated by business-related or personal travel, personal or family illness, or when electronic meeting is the only available option. Now, it should be noted that this language is only, what'd you call it, Brian, hortatory, which is, in other words, you're exhorting you to come to council meetings. If there was ever an abuse of this policy, the council can compel, but you'd have to take some additional steps. But this is the policy statement that's proposed. This is how they would look together. And if you're favorable, we'd ask that a motion be made and then voted on by the council.
I'd like to make the motion that we adopt this into our handbook.
I have a motion by Mr. Harding,
I'll second.
second by Councillor Ellsworth. Is there any discussion, Mr. Fillmore?
Just a comment, the language there at the end is pretty absolutist. Or when an electronic meeting is the only available option. So if I'm lying sick in bed, got some deathly illness, I can still be carted over here and planted in my chair. I mean, it ought to be a reasonable disqualifier, don't you think?
It makes a provision for personal illness. So I can see that electronic meeting as being, maybe there's an earthquake and we can't drive over here.
I can come up with all kinds of imaginative scenarios. I'm just saying the only available option is pretty strong language.
Sorry, that very last phrase really pertains to when we've gone, as we did for much of the last 16 months, where the meetings were all electronic.
So Cliff, I think you're saying that, and again, it's because there's an or, right? So necessitated by business or personal travel, necessitated by personal or family illness, or when an electronic meeting is the only meeting variant that's happening, right? You're essentially saying when there isn't an in-person meeting.
Correct. Yeah, the or makes all the difference. I could see that.
But Bill, if you want to, be hauled in on your deathbed, we'll accommodate you.
I would want a couple of trumpets being played.
Okay.
Flags waving.
Well, you don't ask for much. We can do that. So are you wanting to propose it? Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? I'll call for a vote.
Yeah,
then. Yes, Mr. Hoban.
Hey, I put in a different headset. Can you guys hear me better?
A little bit, yes.
A little bit? Oh, okay. Well, I guess I'm not opposed to this really, but I think there was some thoughts going through my head of, why do we need to be at the meeting in person? Meaning, do we feel like we didn't do our job well over the last year, 15 months prior to coming back? It seems a little archaic to think that somebody can't do the job unless they're there in person every week. And as far as I can recall, I've never missed a work or council meeting. So I'm not really, well, and thank you for allowing me to attend remotely, for enabling this to the staff. But I guess I'm just thinking of, like, are we discouraging certain people from trying to be on the council because we're saying, look, the only way you can be on this council is if you're going to show up for, an 8, 9, or 10-hour period, every other Tuesday, or what, however it is that our meetings are going to line up. I know that we're making some changes so that it's every week and it'll be split up, but I don't know. It just seems a little archaic to say the only way you can be a public servant in this role is to be here in person. I'm thinking of somebody like maybe a father or mother who could attend remotely, and maybe this father has a 12-year-old daughter or son who can watch the rest of the children most of the time. But if if something, and then they can be there just in case of an emergency. But I don't know. It just seems a little archaic to me to require people to attend in person, and that might discourage certain socioeconomic statuses or demographics or certain family situations from trying to be on the council. So just something to think about. I'm not opposed to this, but I guess I worry a little bit about some of the unintended consequences. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hoban. Deep question. I guess just thought that popped into my mind is it probably a lot depends on what our residents expect. If our residents are expecting to see us all here, then this is probably appropriate. And if we get to the point where they're comfortable with that type of remote participation, maybe a clause like this wouldn't be needed. Mr. Hanley.
I do think the phrase "it is the expectation" is at least, it's not saying it's a requirement. I mean, to Mr. Fillmore's point, on the other hand, it does say when an electronic meeting is the only available option, maybe the best available option might be better phrasing there to just sort of, anyway, I don't know if it matters because of the word expectation gives some sense that this is, I'm comfortable with saying it's a stated expectation, but I'm also comfortable as long as it's allowable under this paragraph that, there are extenuating circumstances that we're not going to make people sign in blood and review their home circumstances to make sure it's truly necessary or not. I think it's a relationship of trust, basically.
I do note that there's no penalty provision. It's not a misdemeanor to miss a meeting or anything like that. I think there is a public expectation, historical, traditional, whatever you want to call it. I think the presumption ought to be that we're going to be here unless we have a really good reason not to be.
Just a reminder to pull your microphones in front of your face when you're talking. We had a hard time hearing you. Brian actually had a suggested motion, and that would be rather than "or when electronic media is the only available option," starting with the or when no in-person meeting is held would be his suggested change to that.
Sure.
Okay. Would
I will make that substitute motion.
Substitute motion for Mr. Harding.
I'll second.
Second from Councilor Ellsworth. Any other discussion on the motion? I just one last comment and then let's go ahead and vote. I the childcare thing, that does kind of stick in my mind a little bit. I can see situations where a counselor could legitimately want to be there at home and maybe not necessarily all the time. So I don't know. I'm comfortable passing this, but maybe that is something we should think about.
I agree with exactly what you said. I hope that there is some flexibility for childcare or familial issues. I do feel comfortable with this though, just because it says it's an expectation. And when these things pop up as they do, then I think we're all willing to be flexible and no one's going to punitively, push this onto someone.
Right. Agree. Thank you.
I might add in the conversation that I referred to earlier, one of the elements of that conversation was recognition that there is a public and probably a political expectation that people expect you as council members to be seen and be attending the meetings, as they're out there. And that's something every elected official, I think, would have to wrestle with. We stop short of trying to create a policy that isn't just an expectation, but something mandatory. I mean, the state law has in the state code, it has in law a requirement that you're absent or that you're in attendance in your district, for at least 60 days at every given time, right? Or sorry, you're not to be absent from your district for more than 60 days while you're performing in your service without the express permission of the council. And so there's already a requirement there. We didn't want to go that far. We just recognize that there are circumstances that come up that you're not going to be available for whatever reason. Maybe you have a prolonged illness, or in those kinds of cases, you come to the council, you talk about it and just get some clearance to go forward that way. But the occasional thing, I mean, there are days when I'd be happy to attend at home because I have the childcare issues. So that these things happen.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Fillmore.
I assume this isn't a prelude to another policy amendment about counselors wanting to preclude a quorum and take off on a private plane to DC to avoid voting.
I don't know that there's anything in state law about that, so we're not going there.
Okay, I think we're ready to vote. All in favor? And I see everyone.
Yes.
Mr. Hoban. Okay, so that is unanimous in the affirmative. Let's move on to item number, let's see. Actually, we are at 4:30. Can we do you after this next item, Mr. Holmes? Okay, thank you. Really appreciate your flexibility. So let's move on to item number 7, which is a presentation. Excuse me. We're going to go to item number 8, which is a presentation on the Provo River Delta Restoration Project to be presented by Melissa Stamp of the Mitigation Commission.
So this is my controller. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I just want to start by saying how much I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Again, my name is Melissa Stamp. I'm a project coordinator with a small federal agency called the Mitigation Commission. Our executive director, Mark Holden, sends his regrets. He would have been here, but he's out of state taking care of some family commitments. Mike Mills is also here. He's another project coordinator with our agency. And I think some of you may know Mike from his previous position with the June Sucker program. So again, really appreciate your time today. So this slide is just kind of an overview of where we're headed together on our little journey the next 20, 30 minutes or so. I want to start by giving you an overview of the project and then spend some time kind of highlighting the outreach we've done with stakeholders and specifically some of the coordination we've been doing with Provo City for many years now. And then wrap up by highlighting a couple of land transaction items that we still need to complete with the city that will require some council action in the near future. So that's kind of where we're headed. This map is showing an overview of the Provo River Delta project area. Just to help orient yourselves, we're looking at the mouth of the river. Utah Lake State Park is kind of down at the bottom left on your slide, and the new Provo High School is near the top right. And basically, the project involves acquiring about 260 acres of agricultural land, and we will be diverting the majority of the Provo River's flow into that area and creating a constructed network of braided river channels and delta ponds. We will also be lowering the northern half of Skipper Bay Dike. That's the area shown in dotted yellow line on your map. And that will allow Utah Lake to expand eastward and reoccupy something closer to its historic shoreline. I want to also point out, while this slide is up, that the existing river channel will remain in place and will continue to receive a small amount of flow. There will also be a number of different recreation features and trails constructed as part of the project, and I'll get into those in a little more detail. So what is it going to look like? This slide is showing a similar project that was completed at the mouth of Hobble Creek, which is the tributary just south of Provo Airport. And that project was completed back in 2008. And it's similar. It involves reconfiguring the river channel into a network of braided channels, constructed ponds, and a much widened floodplain. And the focus is to create some nursery and rearing habitat for young fish. The Provo Delta project will be about 12 times bigger than that Hobble Creek effort, so definitely a bigger scale. And these slides I wanted to show, these images, to kind of emphasize that the project is going to be wet. We're lowering a historic levee that's been blocking the lake from an area that historically was a bay, the Skipper Bay of Utah Lake. So it is going to be wet. It's going to be lake-like. The images up here are simulated water depths for the Provo River Delta at different flow and lake conditions. The center image is kind of highlighting a wet springtime condition when we have a big snowmelt runoff coming down the river and the lake elevation is high. And the darker blue colors on these images are deeper water. So you can see under that wet spring condition, almost the entire area is wet. There are a few patches of higher ground that will remain dry, but there's a very complete inundation of that lowered Skipper Bay Dike and a very direct connection with the lake. Whereas the image on the far right is more of a typical summertime condition. It's kind of what we'd be seeing this summer if we were out on the Delta and it was constructed. So there are definitely more dry patches, but a lot of the area remains shallowly inundated even under those drier conditions. And what we're trying to go for really is a lot of emergent and rooted aquatic vegetation type wetland habitats, bulrush communities, pondweed communities, those drier pockets that do dry out during the summer. We'll be planting willows and cottonwood type communities there. And again, the focus is that larval rearing habitat for the newly hatched fish and the juvenile fish, where they can find some cover from predators and a lot of food. I do want to spend a couple slides kind of emphasizing the recreation features that are also a big part of this project. And I think, as most of you know, as Utah Valley continues to grow and develop these open spaces, these protected open spaces that provide access to nature and recreation opportunities are only becoming that much more valuable. And so we think that's a very exciting and important part of the project. In terms of trails, I want to emphasize that we're going to be constructing a long trail. It's the orange line along the southern boundary of the map. And that's a place where we'll be building a berm along that boundary, essentially to keep high river flows from flooding the properties to the south. And a paved trail will be constructed on top of that. It'll be similar in style to the existing Provo River Parkway Trail along the existing river, and it's going to tie into that trail as well as into the new trail that will be part of Provo City's Lakeview Parkway project. We are lowering that northern half of Skipper Bay Dike, which does have a 1 mile dead end trail on it right now. And so that's the area circled in yellow. But essentially what we'll be doing is almost pivoting that trail length onto this new constructed berm and then extending it and tying it in to create some loop opportunities. And it's going to be following what will become essentially the new lake shoreline. And it's new, but it's old because that's where the lake was before the dikes were put in originally. We'll also be building a viewing tower and a trailhead parking area with river access in this part of the project. And these images are just kind of some concepts of features like the viewing tower, fishing platforms, interpretive exhibits. These are not totally finalized yet. We're a couple years out from constructing the recreation features, but give you an idea of what we're kind of looking at for some of those elements. I want to spend a minute on the existing river channel. Like I said, it's going to continue to receive water and it will stay in place. One of the biggest elements is that we will be building a dam, a small dam down in the state park, and that's going to essentially pond water upstream and create a fairly constant water elevation year round. We'll also be installing an aeration system to help with dissolved oxygen and maintain good water quality. And we'll also be implementing a variety of recreation enhancements along the existing channel. Those include fishing platforms and like kayak put-ins, portages around the diversion structure and around the downstream dam. And one element I do want to highlight is the area circled in pink on this slide. And that is where we've been partnering with Provo City Parks and Recreation to come up with designs for a new trailhead park. And that is a project that's being called Provo River Delta Gateway Park. And it's going to include river access, a nature-themed playground, various interpretive features, restroom parking, those kind of elements. And this is on property that we currently own and that we intend to convey to Provo City. And the idea would be that we fund construction. We've already through a funding agreement with Parks and Recreation, we've already funded them to hire a design consultant and develop the designs, and we've worked in partnership. It's been a great group to work with, and also we've worked with a neighborhood design committee with local residents, and it's been really fun to come up with this great park amenity. And so that's kind of the game plan for Delta Gateway Park. Like I said, we're going to be working on a new agreement to fund construction and convey that land to the city. So that's kind of the recap of the main features of the park. I wanted to spend a little time talking to you about the purpose of the project. And really at its heart, the need for the project is driven by the need to recover the June sucker. And the June sucker is a federally listed, once endangered, now threatened. It was downlisted by Fish and Wildlife Service at the start of this year. And I'm going to ask Mike to do a little show and tell with you guys, if that's okay. Is that allowed? Okay, so you guys can pass this along. Have any of you seen a live June sucker in the wild? Shannon saying yes. No one else. Well, yeah, you have as well. Excellent. Put it on your calendars for next year, unless it's a huge spring runoff, which would be awesome for various reasons. But if the flows are relatively low, about 4 or 5 weeks ago, you could have had a really good view of the fish spawning in the river. They're very visible around Lakeshore Drive Bridge, which will continue to be a great spawning visibility spot even after the Delta project. But yeah, we're passing around a model of an adult June sucker. And I think some people think it's a small fish. It's a pretty sizable fish. I think they weigh about 5 pounds. And they live 40 years. So it's a surprisingly long-lived fish. It's what's called a lake sucker. It's not a bottom feeding sucker. You may notice on the model that its lips are kind of more forward facing. It kind of it evolved to share the Utah Lake ecosystem with the Utah sucker, which is the more traditional bottom feeding sucker. And that's a native fish that's more widespread throughout Utah and is not endangered or threatened. So they're long lived. They live most of their life in Utah Lake, but in the springtime, hence the name June sucker, they run up the tributaries to spawn, stay there a couple weeks or so, lay their eggs, and then head back to the lake. So those are a few facts about June sucker. I'm also going to have Mike pass around, don't open it because it's like stinky, alcohol or something. But this is a jar of little June sucker larvae. So this is what these guys look like shortly after they hatch up out of the gravel and start drifting downstream. And the reason I think these are kind of interesting to look like, they kind of just look like blobs with eyeballs. They're not super exciting. But the point is, do they look like they could swim very well? No, not really. They can wiggle a bit, but they're not great swimmers for some time. And so one of the underlying needs for this habitat restoration is the fact that currently, I mean, these fish used to number in the millions. They're a big part of the food source for Native American civilizations, starting back more than 10,000 years ago. These fish are an important food source. They helped early Mormon pioneers get through a hard winter in 1848. But the numbers dropped as low as about 300 was the estimate in the late 90s. The population has recovered through a good hatchery program, numbering in about 10,000. So they're laying all these eggs that are hatching into millions of larvae, but the problem is they're not surviving right now. We've got a bottleneck in that life cycle. And so these little guys have to kind of rely on the current to drift them down and get them to land in good habitat where they can hide from predators, where they can find food. And right now, that existing lowest mile of the Provo River, it's been historically dredged, it's leveed, it has a wonderful shady trail along it, but it is not terribly natural and it doesn't have access to those bulrush or pondweed communities. So these larvae tend to kind of get stuck. They don't get pushed all the way out towards the state park where there is some wetland habitat. And so the idea is to bring the lake to them with this new project and create that habitat and make it so that they can drift into that habitat. So I think that's most of what I wanted to touch on with the show and tell. I did want to also emphasize while the slide is up that this effort is very much a multi-agency effort. Again, I'm with the Mitigation Commission. Our joint lead agencies are Central Utah Water District and the U.S. Department of the Interior. And we're all kind of working as well under the umbrella of the June Sucker Recovery Implementation Program, which is a 9 or maybe 10 Mike agency cooperative program. So lots of players involved, and it's taken a lot of cooperation to get it as far as it's gotten. So biggest purpose is recovering June sucker. Again, recreation and also flow, in-stream flow targets are also components of the project purpose. This slide I kind of wanted to emphasize, like I just described, the Provo Delta project is kind of embedded in June sucker recovery in the outline of that fish. So it's essential for that last step, that bottleneck to recover the fish and complete the life cycle so they can live to be adults. But June sucker recovery is also a big component of water supply to the Wasatch Front and Utah Valley. Continued development and ongoing operation of Bonneville Unit water supplies is dependent on sufficient progress being made with June sucker recovery. So there are various environmental commitments associated with some of the federal water projects, the Central Utah Project, that essentially brings some of Utah's share of the Colorado River over the divide to supply millions of users along the Wasatch Front. And I think Provo City only uses a very small amount of Central Utah water. You guys are able to rely more on local wells and springs, but certainly it's relevant to the overall economy of Utah Valley to make sure we don't get crosswise with June sucker recovery. Wanted to just highlight where we're at and where we're going schedule-wise. So we're partway through 2021. We started project construction spring of 2020, so we're about a year and a half in at this point, and we are continuing to excavate. We're digging, digging ponds and channels that will continue into next year. We're hoping to transition fairly early next year into lowering Skipper Bay Dike, which will take quite a bit of time as well. We're aiming to divert the river into the constructed delta next year in November. And in 2023, we'll be finishing up the recreation features and doing the work in the existing channel, hoping to finish everything up in 2024. The small dam is going to take multiple phases. So that's kind of my overview portion. I'll be shifting next to just kind of recapping some of the stakeholder coordination and outreach we've been doing throughout the history of the project and currently. So this project has a long history. Anyone who's familiar with it is well aware. I think early concepts for the project were developed back in the early 2000s, realizing that we probably need to do something about the habitat for the young fish. An environmental impact statement process happened between 2011 and was completed in 2015. And then we've been working on acquisition and designs and started construction just last year. And I wanted to emphasize that there has been interaction with stakeholders all along the way. So during that EIS process, we heard a lot of input from the community and from the city, and that definitely informed elements of the alternative that was selected. Knowing that the community definitely wanted to maintain that existing channel as a community amenity has definitely guided our decision-making and design process. We knew we wanted to limit acquisition of that private agricultural land, which is also a very valuable amenity to the west side of Provo. And we heard early on from the city about strong concerns regarding potential bird strike airport hazards. And that is certainly something we've taken very seriously, and it has informed some of our decisions all along since the EIS process started. As we moved into the design process, that engagement continued. We've incorporated some elements of the design and the vegetation types we've selected for revegetation to accommodate input we received related to airport and bird strike concerns. We've been coordinating very thoroughly, like I mentioned, great working relationship with Provo City Parks and Recreation, and then Utah County as well as various user groups as we've developed our recreation features. And we've made adjustments as we negotiated with neighboring landowners about the exact acquisition boundary. And then we've been coordinating heavily with Provo City on their Lakeview Parkway process, all through the design and redesign components and now with construction. And so that's where some of our land transaction items will come up. As I mentioned, we're continuing that coordination during construction phase, particularly with respect to Lakeview Parkway, since those projects are so physically close together, making sure we're not getting in each other's way, and making sure timing of things makes sense. And that group has been awesome to work with on your staff. A couple other items I wanted to highlight. Like I said, there's been a lot of emphasis on Lakeview Parkway. And back in 2017 is when we executed a funding agreement. And that contains a lot of provisions that essentially compensate Provo City for the new engineering costs and construction costs associated with, hey, we just made 2 rivers instead of 1. So you have an extra bridge to build and all those components that are very expensive. So that agreement is to the tune of about $12.9 million. I think we're about halfway through that. We help fund those redesign components and the first phases of construction and are continuing to do so as construction occurs right now. One other agreement with the city I wanted to highlight has been wonderful for both parties. I think it's probably saved each party potentially millions of dollars. As I said, we've been busy digging lots of channels, lots of deep ponds, and we're generating a lot of material, more than we need on site. And so most of that material that we don't need has been getting hauled to the future site of the Provo Regional Sports Park over by the airport. And so that's been a huge cost savings. Both the city doesn't have to pay to import that, and we don't have to pay to dispose of it somewhere. So that's worked out amazingly well. Really appreciate that. And then, as I alluded to, and Wayne could speak to more, he's been working very closely with Mark Holden, in particular, on the airport hazard mitigation agreement, as well as with our joint lead agencies. And that is getting close to completion. And one of those elements will include us providing partial funding for a new position at the airport, as well as funding that we've been providing for 4 years now, doing bird movement and monitoring study. We've observed over 1 million birds now, and you can check out all that data on our website if anyone's interested. I also want to just mention one of our staff, Paula Trader, has done a great job of connecting with some of the environmental science teachers at Provo High School. I mean, basically this project is in their backyard. So it's an awesome outdoor classroom opportunity. And we've done some tours with the school groups. And then this spring, I think it was in May, They helped with a cottonwood transplanting activity, taking some young cottonwoods that had self-seeded and moving them to be planted in areas where they won't get put underwater once we connect the river. So I anticipate that will continue. I'm hoping we'll do a fall activity, and hopefully in the years to come, that relationship will continue. In terms of more broad outreach, again, we have I'll mention we have an excellent project website. I'd encourage you all to visit if you're interested in more information. We have newsletters that come out in the spring and fall. If anyone is interested, I do have a sign-in sheet that you could pass around if you want, Mike. So you won't get a ton of email. You can get those by email. We've been doing outreach in coordination with the Utah Lake Commission. We've also been doing this year Saturday site tours on the second Saturday of every month. And Councillor Ellsworth joined us last month, and all of you are welcome in the future, or we'd be happy to arrange a custom council tour sometime as well. The next one's August 14th, I believe, if anyone wants to sign up. And Mayor Kafusi has also visited the project, I think, last year. We've also been doing some connecting with anglers along the existing river, trying to make sure they're aware of the project. Things will get a little crazy while we're diverting the river and doing some of the modifications to the existing channel in about a year and a half. So trying to make sure people are aware that that's coming down the line. So last thing I want to touch on before, I don't know if you guys are welcome to ask questions, but just again, back to this land transaction item. There's a number of different areas related to the project where we will need some interaction with the city. The one I'd only really want to touch on one in detail today, which is sort of the most time sensitive and the priority, is the areas where we need to be able to build the river channel on either side of Lakeview Parkway. And so that is the yellow outlined box and arrow on this slide. And it's essentially the pieces that connect on either side. We own all the property north of Boat Harbor Drive already, but Provo currently owns those pieces on either side of where the new bridge will be constructed. And essentially the city was a little ahead of us with getting land acquisitions started for their right of way. And so they picked up some bigger pieces, knowing that our project would need either easements or ownership of some of those long term. And when we did execute that 2017 agreement to cooperate and fund redesign elements of Lakeview Parkway, we anticipated this. And I've highlighted one of the clauses, that sort of indicates that we've known all along we're going to have to do some land swapping as we get close to the end here. I think at this point we need most of the land need is for us to get it from Provo, but there is a small sliver that Provo will want that we currently own that they will want to be part of their long-term right-of-way of the road. So it is kind of a two-way aspect that we need to resolve. And just kind of want to just include this. Nothing is ready for action by you guys right now, but my understanding, we've been coordinating with staff, and my understanding is that we will need the council to put these properties on the surplus list before we can execute the transactions. And so just kind of, this is a heads up that that's coming before you, probably in the next month or two. And city staff have been wonderful to work with. But it's a messy area. There's a lot of slivers and challenging parcel dimensions, and figuring out the exact cost adjustment, how much extra money you guys had to pay to get those chunks that you don't really want to hold on to. We're still working through that. And we will be following up with you, I guess, when the time comes to make those transactions. And I just did want to emphasize, though, there is kind of a financial mechanism already built into this agreement where we're reimbursing the city already for the construction costs, and we are able to reimburse the city for those extra land costs. So that may streamline some things potentially. And I know the lawyers are looking at it. So that, I think, is all I wanted to share with you today. Again, encourage you to get out and join us for a site tour, check out our website, get in touch if you want to know more about the June Sucker Recovery Program. The Delta Project is just one element of that, and there are definitely other opportunities for the city to be involved with that program. if anyone wants us to come present at one of your neighborhood meetings or something like that, we'd love to do that if you have constituents that are interested. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have any questions, Mr. Fillmore?
Just a couple. Melissa, thank you so much. I've been wanting to get my head around this
Excellent.
project, and your presentation has been very enlightening. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Two questions. One just simple one. What fish family is the June sucker come from?
It is genus Chasmistes, and I'm going to defer to Mike on more detail than that. He is the biologist.
The family is Catastomidae. It's basically the family that includes all of the sucker species of fish.
Because when I was growing up, sucker was synonymous with carp.
Yeah,
And-
carp are in a completely different family. Carp are in Cyprinidae.
So this is not a part of the trout family or anything like that.
Salmonidae.
But apparently quite edible because the Indians thrived on them. Is that what we?
The June sucker?
Yeah.
Yeah, they are quite edible. They are quite bony. And so when you moved into the early 1900s, a lot of the people who were collecting them were actually bottling them. And that took care of the bones, so to speak, because that made them a lot softer to be able to eat them. But aside from the bones, they're pretty edible.
So do you see them to be a genuine game fish for anglers in the future?
If we get to that point in recovery, they do fight extremely well in terms of providing sport for somebody fishing. I question if they'll become a popular food fish. I guess it could happen, but you compare them to a walleye, which many people consider to be the best tasting freshwater fish, and then they're pretty mediocre that way.
Okay, but they won't, from what I heard you say, they won't contribute to stirring up the lake bed like the carp do.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Monique. My other question was simply, I'm curious as to the overall cost of this project. What is that projected to be, start to finish?
Yeah, it's projected to be very big. It is 50 million is our current projection. Caveats to that though, approximately, I don't have my perfect breakdown handy, but about 25% of that is related to both, it's very expensive to work with the Lakeview Parkway redesign, so accommodating the utility component, both that roadway, and we had about a $6 million ticket item to relocate a gas line that runs north-south through the project area and was only buried about 2 to 3 feet below the farm fields. And that needed to be deeper so we could build ponds, obviously. So that was also a big cost. So some of the costs are associated with the fact that there's infrastructure that has essentially been built in what historically was a lake bed that we're trying to restore. And so, the actual land acquisition and restoration costs, like what we're doing right now, I think is about only a third of that total cost. Total. The recreation components are also about like 15 to 20%. So also a significant cost component.
Is that 50 million entirely federal money?
It is. And I have a caveat on that as well. It is in the sense our agency is fully funding it. And we are a federal agency. Some of our money is associated with what's called a Title IV account, which was created when our agency came into existence in 1992. And it's essentially a large endowment account, but we've been drawing on it partly to fund this project because congressional appropriations haven't kept up. And that Title IV account for multiple years was fed into with some state money, with water district money and Western area power money, in addition to other federal money. So there is some blending kind of historically, but that hasn't happened for, I think, at least 10 years. And so, yeah, it's essentially federal.
More than 90% would be federal funds.
Yes, I think that would be accurate to say. Yeah, and, again, it's a bit of a commitment cost. It's one of the costs of this overall Central Utah project. And I think it's in the 5% cost range of some of the elements that commit to June sucker recovery for that water development.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Hardy?
This was very helpful. I've tried to keep an eye on the project for the past 10 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's exciting. I'm really supportive of, and I think it's going to be a great thing for the lake, a great thing for the ecology, a great thing for the community as well. So this is wonderful. I think this presentation though was the first time that I really understood that I think you called it the Skipper Bay Dike is being is basically being removed.
Yeah.
I think that's unfortunate. I see what we've done with the Bonneville Shoreline Trail, which I think for pretty much my entire lifetime, the community's been working towards. And now it's getting to the point where it's, we've got some pretty long sections. Same with the Jordan River Trail. When it first started, it was just a little bit here, a little bit there, but eventually it all connected. Now the Provo River Trail spans into the Jordan River Trail, is all part of this Golden Spoke Trail system. And and how popular these trails are. I just look at Vineyard's got their section. It looks like Lehigh, I believe, has some parts. Provo into Orem has this little section. And it just seems that if we could create that into and it may be another 50 years before it's done, but I think that could be a really important part. Have you looked at, making it a boardwalk or something so it can still function both ways?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll touch on why we haven't incorporated that yet to date in a second, but I will emphasize first that the new berm trail that essentially the south half of Skipper Bay Dike Trail will then make this big right-hand turn and follow east and then connect to the Lakeview Parkway Trail to head north. And I think the idea is to connect that into the Wakara Way work and the Vineyard Trail Network. So it should connect into some of those more lake-wide goals of those master trail plans. Even without something along Skipper Bay Dike. The reason we haven't included it is maybe twofold. I mean, it is pretty much essential that we lower that dike and reestablish that stronger connection and mixing of kind of the lake and riverine environment. But as you noted, as I pointed out, kind of on those water depth slides, in the summer, the flow will just be exiting through 4 outlet channels and the rest will be dry. And we will be building that essentially with some hardening to kind of hold up to wave action and wind action and ice, which are mostly all the reasons we're not trying to do bridges or boardwalks to maintain a trail system, because it just can be a high energy environment. I think it remains to be seen a little bit too, though, how high energy that plays out to be. I think we're going to be seeing new wetland vegetation developing with this fresh water source heading out into the lake in that area. And I think there is possibility long-term. It would be expensive though. It'd have to be very high and very engineered to hold up to those kind of conditions. And we are intending, the biologists are going to be wanting to use those isolated connection points during low lake conditions to monitor the fish. So we're intending that to be like ATV drivable. I bet it's going to be super popular for fishing. Like people are going to walk out there regardless. Some people will be fine with walking through a foot of water, and going farther north. The birding will continue to be excellent up in that area. So I suspect it will be an informal trail, even if we don't fund that. And we don't have the funding to do an engineered system there. But I think it will, and we're open. I think the future is open. The property will be transferred to Division of Wildlife is our vision. So it won't be federal after construction is complete. That area where the dike is currently state-owned fire forestry state lands. At least some of it. There's some land history there, but so that could be something in the play longer term if those agencies are amenable.
Thank you. That's encouraging.
Yeah.
Mr. Henley.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mike. I don't know if you remember me, but Mike and I picked Mike's brain about 15 years ago about the June sucker to write about it. So he was very, very helpful to me, and I'm glad to know you're still on the project and still involved. This is extremely exciting. And I think for Provo, this is an opportunity to really make this area more central to our community. I mean, if you know the river restoration project in Heber Valley, that's an absolute gem now for that entire area because of the way they've rebraided the river, and it's brought back so much wildlife and recreation, and it's just a stunningly beautiful area. So I think this is going to be a really wonderful opportunity when the time comes. I don't know what the proper moment is to actually like christen a project like this, but assuming our mayor is reelected, maybe I shouldn't assume that, but I'm gonna boldly say I assume it. But if she's reelected, I mean, I'm hoping that we can find a way when the time is right to really mark it. And I would love to find a way to honor the people who gave up their property for this. I know the Despain family personally, but I know other families. I'd love to be able to, I don't know if it's a plaque or something, but some way of honoring the history of that land. We're honoring its ancient history by bringing it back to what it was. But I think there's the intermediate history that needs to be honored. And that was a big sacrifice for a lot of those people to do this. But I think what they gave us is going to be a blessing to future generations for a very long time. So it ought to be recognized. Anyway, that's my little plug for, I know that maybe you can put Nicole Martin on that project, Mayor, and find a way to really make it a fun public celebration. But I think it'll be a great day. I don't know what you would recommend is the moment to do that, but that's something to think about.
We have been and will continue to think about that. We kind of got pandemicked out on our groundbreaking last year. We did do essentially a video style groundbreaking, which is not nearly as fun. So I love that idea, and I love the idea of honoring some of the landowners that allowed us to purchase their property to do the project. I think those are both great ideas. So we'll stay in touch.
All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate this update presentation.
Again, thanks for the time.
All right, we'll jump back now to item number 6, which is a presentation on the Innovation Grant Fund Program, and this is to be presented by Dixon Holmes, our Assistant CAO.
Council Chair, Vice Chair, and council members. Just wanted to give you a quick update on the Innovation Grant Fund. So 2 years ago, we had 14 applications, and we funded approximately 6 of those. This year we had 27 applications, and we funded 7 of those. It's been pretty helpful to those persons and or departments or divisions to think outside the box in the way they deliver their product or their service. And most of them aren't delivering a physical product, as you would probably guess, but it's the delivery of service. This year or last year, we granted or we provided funds up to $25,000. We started out this year with the same cap of $25,000, but as we saw the number of applicants or applications that we had received, we actually took it down to $20,000, and that allowed us to pick up and fund one more additional. From last year, and I say last year, that would have been fiscal year 20. Just having finished 21, we had funded, just to remind you of what those were, we funded a teeny survey robot. I don't know if you remember that. This is something that they could use to avoid being out in the road. We also funded a portion of the mobile outreach vehicle for the library. We also funded a project called Turf Tank, of which I'll show you a video in a moment, that allows for the programming in of spraying lines for ball fields or any type of play field that the Parks and Rec. We also funded for the police department some peer support for our police officers. We also provided funding for next generation CPR dummies. And if you as a council office have not had the opportunity to get down with a dummy into the beat of Staying Alive, I would encourage you to do that. It will give real-time feedback as to your effectiveness and efficiency in providing CPR, and literally a real lifesaver. I would encourage the council office to take advantage of that. And then we also provided funding for some air quality monitors. So in this latest round, of which probably later this fall or early spring, we'll have another presentation such as this to give you a little more feedback on how some of those went. The 27 applicants and then funding only 7 of those, we provided some temporary traffic calming devices, security and weather cameras for our snowplow operations, kind of a dual feature there, one to be able to check the roads, but to also provide security at different locations. Provided individual first aid kits per officer for the police department, a drone for the fire department, a locking mechanism for Parks and Recreation for the soccer fields for the goals, so they can keep them locked up, keep them from falling over, but they can also then be used, and they have a locking system that they can give a temporary password or passcode. We also provided funding for Stop the Bleed training also for the fire department, and then for our media services, some virtual reality content, and we're excited to see how that will play out in the future of being able to promote Provo City services through virtual reality. So if you could just roll this next video, it's just a little 2-minute clip on the turf tank.
Hi, I'm Sean Whitaker, Sport Field and Program Manager for Provo Parks and Recreation in Provo, Utah. Our goal in Provo is to always look for new ways to be innovative in our approach to the programs and services we offer to our constituents. One of the recent innovations we have added to our programs is the Turf Tank. Turf Tank is an autonomous GPS paint robot designed to perform consistent and accurate field lines for a variety of sports. It eliminates the need for a manual operator and increases efficiency in the field line painting process. Field lines will be painted almost perfectly with an error rate of 3 centimeters or less. It also enables us to reduce our paint consumption and maximize our labor resources, saving the community thousands of dollars annually. Before the implementation of the Turf Tank, it took one member of our field prep staff 32 hours to measure, mark, and paint the fields for our soccer program alone. This is almost an entire week worth of staff hours used to complete the process. It takes an additional 5 hours per week for 36 consecutive weeks to repaint the fields throughout the various seasons. That's a total of 180 total staff hours, or 4.5 paid weeks just spent painting fields. With our current full-time employee, that's almost $6,000 per year. And that doesn't include our peak season when we have 2 to 4 seasonal staff also helping with the process. With Turf Tank, our time to paint fields has been cut by at least 60%. The need no longer exists to measure, drag string, mark, and paint. A trained operator need only decide which size field to paint and where, and press a button. Our Turf Tank was purchased through an innovation grant offered through Provo City. We're grateful to the Mayor of Provo and the Municipal Council for offering such opportunities to each department so we can continue to offer a high level of programs to the members of our community.
It's not a Roomba. The other thing that we've done with the Innovation Grant Fund is one to recognize those that have been selected and even those that participated. So we provided a $25 recognition for those who submitted. Maybe that's why we had 27 this year as opposed to 14 or so last year. And then it was several $100s then for those who were selected. Our selection committee, we typically get a local entrepreneur and then a couple other representatives from BYU and UVU. And so that was and then Wayne and myself were on that committee also. So anyway, it's been very helpful, as I mentioned, to our departments. I think it's been productive. Typically running about $120,000 a year is what that cost generally ends up being. And again, as you recall, that portion of that comes from the carryover from the budget savings. So any questions for me?
Mr. Hardy?
Let me just reiterate how much I love this program, and I'd be open to recommendations from the administration if there's need, or if we feel like we could expand the budget on the program, particularly on these items that are saving us money in the long run, but also just doing things that we probably should be doing anyway, but in such an innovative way. I just really love this thing, and anything we can do to support it, I'd love to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. All right, let's jump over now to item number 7, which is a presentation regarding the neighborhood program. Mr. Strachan.
Council, thank you. This is a follow-up from last meeting when Karen outlined for you some of the challenges that we have with the program. We're going to break this up into 3 parts. The first part is, what we're intending to do today is to ask you to determine whether we should continue, terminate, or review the neighborhood program. And if you decide to review it, answer the question, who should review it, and what the scope of work should be. So what our intent is to have you, as I walk you through the various sections, we'd like you to consider passing a motion. And the first section is give an indication of what you'd prefer, and then we'll carry on from there.
All right. Do you want us to dive into the first section?
Yeah, so the first section is, what I would suggest is somebody make a motion for one of those 3 and then vote on it.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm just curious, how much time do we have left in this meeting?
Depends on how long you guys take. There's one question up here, and that is the who should review it is probably going to dominate your time. The scope of work, when I present it through, what do we call it, Dave? We were just going to get a sense of the numbers that favor it as an item and just move through it. But really, there's only probably 3 motions that we're asking you to make.
I was just wondering if we're trying to end by 5:30, or are we going to continue past 5:30?
You probably won't finish by 5:30, but if the council is willing to, staff's willing to stay in order to get the closed meeting done as well.
Well, let's discuss that briefly. We had originally budgeted 30 minutes for this item. We are going to skip or defer, I should say, item number 9. So this is the last item before we move to closed session. So the options are, if counselors want to stick to the original schedule, that gives us about 10 minutes. If you're willing to slip by 20 minutes, then we could do the full 30 minutes for this. Mr. Henley?
Just to move this process along, I would move that we review the program.
Okay.
That would be my
getting a motion right out
Yeah.
there quickly. We have a motion by Mr. Henley.
10 to 20 minutes. I think we could decide to review it and then maybe even decide who's going to do it, and we might be okay, but I don't know.
I'll second that motion.
Second by Counselor Ellsworth. Discussion on the motion. Mr. Harding.
I support reviewing it. We kind of talk about these three, terminate, continue, and review. If we're trying to get a pulse on the council, I think we can review with the idea of trying to improve or, I don't know how to say this, but I support reviewing it because I think it is a very valuable program, and I think we can do better with it as well. So that's why I would like to see it reviewed so that we can make it even better than it is now.
Staff sees a review as like a program review, program evaluation, with the expectation that whoever does the review will come back with recommendations. And it's always theoretical that one of the recommendations could be to terminate it, but that's not the expectation.
And while we're at that, before we vote on this, let's just get a sense for that. And this doesn't need to be a motion, but just by a raise of hands, how many counselors are interested in considering terminating the program? Just to kind of get that out there, if that's all right. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so I don't hear anything from Mr. Hoban. So maybe that'll settle that part of it. I guess since we already have a motion to review, the question of continuing the program is kind of moot. So is there any discussion before we vote on that? All right, all in favor?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so we will review the program. Now we have, well, go ahead, Mr. Strachan. I may jump in with an audible here, but.
It's fine, you're the boss, so. So we'll come back to who should review it because we think that might take up more time, but based on the discussions we've had both internally as staff and with leadership and others, we've come up with what we think a scope of review should entail. The next every slide on going forward will be one of these lines, a brief explanation of it, and basically just asking you yes or no. And what I'd ask you to do is, for example, in this first one, you'll see what is the focus of the neighborhood program. So examine the purpose, goal, or focus of it. In terms of voting on whether or not this should be included in the scope of work, I don't want to get into the semantics of what it says on the second line. Just, is this is this an issue that you'd like to have addressed in the review?
I don't see how we can't do that.
I know. Some of these are no-brainers, but there are some that you may not care to investigate.
Well, and maybe just from an efficiency standpoint, then let's show one and have somebody make a comment if they don't want to see that as part of it, because I think what will happen here is that most of them will be part of the review.
Correct.
Okay.
Does that work for you?
That works.
Okay. Including the scope of work, overall focus of the neighborhood program. No objections. I'll ask you to move fast. Number of neighborhoods. 2 objections?
Yeah.
I'm not objecting, I'm saying.
Oh,
I would object to that one. If it's a major change, if a surgical, maybe in 1 or 2, handful of places maybe, but.
Are there enough of you that object that we should take it off?
Well, and Mr. Sewell, I think, just to clarify for the purpose of getting through this quickly, the question is, should it be looked at or not?
Right, okay.
In theory, the idea here is to say whether you think it should be looked at independent of what the answer might be.
Right, I understand that.
Yeah.
And a lot of these, I probably don't feel a need to, but I don't mind either. So thank you. I'll withdraw the objection.
Go through. If you just show me a hand if you object to it. If there's 4 of you, we'll pull it off.
Chair Sewell, or maybe Mr. Strachan, I don't know who I should address, but one other way to do this, just with the knowing where we're at with time and whatnot, would be to ask whatever group we put together to look at this, to come back to the council with a proposal on which of these that they would suggest having a part of the scope of the work. But anyway.
Another way to do it is to look at that list, and is there anything 4 of you would object to having on there?
Yeah, I actually think the more important question here, because I think what we're doing now is we're just going to pretty much end up with this list and with very little real feedback from the council for the committee. And I think the more important question is who. So I think I would lean toward.
So we'll pass this on to the list if that's what you prefer.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll pass this on to whoever the committee is and ask them to look at these because there may be other things. The reason we gave you the list was we had tried polling differently and didn't get enough responses to really know where we were at. So this is why we wanted to do it this way.
Understood.
Councilor Ellsworth?
I just wonder if there's things that aren't on this review that should be on this review, which might be a conversation for another day or for email. But an important issue to me is transparency and accountability, which is not presented here, and the service to the council or service to the public. So some of those aren't specific duties, but fall under the umbrella of good governance. So is that something you can just add in later?
Yeah, we can pass that on. Any suggestions you do have as council members, just email me. We'll add.
It also seems to me that these are potentially, the committee could decide that their focus for the next 3 months or 6 months is going to be 3 of these things, but longer term, they could look at other things because they're not as crucial or they'll have to be worked out later.
Right.
So I'd rather leave it up to the committee to decide what the priorities are, but they could come back to the council and explain their logic.
Okay.
I have a question. Sorry. One of the concerns that came back from a member of the NAB was what scope or what purpose does the council have for this program? Is that captured somewhere? Because right now, this is kind of the full scope of what they do. You're saying the overall focus is it? Okay.
Yeah. So if just really quick, as you go through each of these, and we'll come back to the who in a second here. This is what the overall focus of the neighborhood program would be. That's the question. Should the number of neighborhoods be different? Should they be grouped differently? What do we expect from neighborhood chairs? Does the vice chair, what's the role of the vice chair? Do we elect or appoint? Should there be some sort of rules, code of ethics or anything to follow? What training should we provide to neighborhood? How do you deal with reporting, structure of the reports, requirements, what are the requirements for certain types of meetings, methods for informing residents of meetings, managing neighborhood email lists is one that's come up in the past, visioning as a tool that they can use. Should we still have matching grants as part of the program? What is staff's role with respect to the neighborhood program? So those are all the things that we would put forward as your scope of work for that committee, and how they bite it off and address it is up to the committee. So go back to who should review it. I don't know why, but some of my little question marks on the left fell off. So they're all supposed to be question marks there. So who should review the neighborhood program? Should it be the neighborhood advisory board? Should it be a new committee with just counselors on the NAB? Should it be a new committee with counselors who aren't on the NAB? Should we get an entirely new committee with no counselors? In other words, pick a body from the community and others, or should it be the committee of the whole? What I'm going to tell you is that from our perspective is a committee of the whole is as much as you'd like to have it come. At the end of the day, you're going to have it come back to you, whether you're doing it as a council or as a committee of the whole. But if you want to move expeditiously through a review of the program, better to have a small committee, however you comprise it.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Strachan. I think we'll be diving into council discussion at this point.
I'm going to sit down there in case you have any more questions.
Okay. Thank you.
I just have a question. Did we consider having an outside audit done by, for example, a BYU or UVU graduate program? Is that considered here?
You're welcome to propose that. That could be considered as another option.
It seems to me that would be option number, that's the second to the last option, unless I'm misunderstanding.
Okay.
And we didn't have any direction on whether or not how to pay for it, but that is something you could do as ask for a program evaluation of the program.
Okay, Counselor, so we can have a little discussion about the different options. If somebody has a motion for a particular method that they want to lay out there as a starting point for the discussion, that's okay too. Where would you like to go?
I'll add this. I think it was important, the feedback that we got last time from Brian and from Cliff about not asking people or programs that are being regulated to be part of the regulation creation. Is that how you would say it? I think that was a worthwhile point, that to have some objectivity, it should be somewhat removed.
Mr. Harding.
I think there would be value in getting a fresh perspective, fresh look at this. I think I would lean, if number them top to bottom, I think I would lean towards option 3 or option 4. I have some pretty passionate feelings about the program, and I would love to, to speak to whatever committee to try to share some of that vision. But I think, being a member of the NAB, I probably think that we would get, this would be better served by option 3 or option 4.
Thank you. Councilor Ellsworth.
I would support option 4. And if we did select, for example, a BYU MPA graduate class to do that, I think we could pay for it with that. We reserve a small amount of money every year in case there's like a study that the council specifically wants done, or some legal opinion that we wanted from the outside, right? So I think that may be an appropriate use for that kind of fund if we did want to go that route.
Mr. Shipley.
So there might be a way to combine those, right? My only thought on the BYU issue is I just, like, as we're talking about that, what's cycling around in my head is that we're going to get good suggestions on paper, and there are folks here on the council and experience on the council and from the administration dealing with neighborhood chairs and neighborhood program for years and years that I think perhaps is more beneficial than an outside young perspective. And that perspective might be helpful to guide what we do, maybe with our committee work, but I think we'll still need the committee even if we do engage some outside source.
Mr. Hanley?
Yeah, I think I was going to say something very similar. And actually, I feel that way about current neighborhood chairs. I don't know if it's the people on the NAB or others, but I don't necessarily think that we need to constitute a standing committee, but it seems maybe in somewhat slight disagreement with Cliff's point from last meeting. I think if they're not consulted at all, that just seems really wrong to me. I really want to know what their perspective is. We just got a very thoughtful letter today, actually, from a neighborhood chair who's, a remarkably good example of a neighborhood chair. And so I'd like to know, I'd like to give a committee whatever leeway they want to consult with outside consultants or talk to neighborhood people, use surveys or whatever information we feel like we need to make the best decision, and bring that back to the council, with that information so that we can make good choices. But I love the idea of getting some outside help. I just don't think we need to do that exclusively, I guess, A
couple of points, if I may. One is any committee that's struck could engage whoever they want in terms of bringing them in. I remember when we did the Development Approval Process Review Committee, that committee brought different people in, essentially as witnesses or advisors, and we had conversations about a whole list of things related to development. So I think that's always possible. You could bring in experienced former council members, current council members. You could bring in people who participate in the program, and I think that would be expected. But you could also, borrowing from the model that we see happening in the development community, they very often will have a steering committee managing the contractor. And the consultant will do the legwork on it, but they'll report back to the steering committee, and then when that's ready, you find it going through planning commission and then the council over in that. Did I capture that correctly, Robert? That's what I thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Your work here is done, Robert.
Mr. Fillmore.
Just speaking for myself, I'm not anywhere near ready to hand this over to an outside group to tell us what they think we ought to do. They'd be coming up from a vacuum, really. I would much rather get an ad hoc committee together that some one or two past council members, current council members. I'm not opposed to people who are on the NAB right now, but the program, obviously, the concept is a good one, right? It just doesn't work nearly as well as it should. We have some neighborhood chairs who are terrific, others who are not so terrific, and others who simply are missing in action. It seems to me like we ought to take a top to bottom look at it, but do it within the context of our own experience, and as opposed to an outside advisory group. But we ought to get that input at some point later, once we have a sense as a council of what we really want out of the program. And then if you want to get some outside input, pros and cons of what we're thinking, I think it makes some sense at that point.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. I'd like to kind of piggyback on that for a moment. I agree. I think this is a good topic for a council committee. Ideally, I would have preferred that the NAB tackle this. It's kind of their responsibility in code, but I think both counselors on the NAB, who are both very passionate about this from different perspectives, have kind of expressed a preference to do it a different way. And I would probably include myself in the group of counselors who are passionate about the program. And so what I'm leaning toward is selecting a group of 2 or 3 counselors who are maybe a little not as passionate, or maybe a little more able to step back and look at it a little more objectively. And so I'm going to make a suggestion. I don't think I'd like to phrase it as a motion because I'm the chair, but we'll see if any other counselors like this suggestion. Is I'd propose that we form an ad hoc committee to review this, consisting of Councilors Handley, Shipley, and Hoban. If those 3 are interested, or maybe 2 of them, if only 2 of them are interested. And then they can enlist the help of whoever they feel like would be helpful, neighborhood chairs, past counselors, and others. Okay.
Is it too late to go back to forming a new committee with no counselors now that you've made that recommendation? Just kidding. I wasn't looking to be on another committee, but I'm happy to do this, knowing that it's needed. So if that's, anyway, I don't know how the others feel. I don't know how Mr. Shipley or Mr. Hoban feel, but I'm willing to do it.
I'm happy to serve.
Thank you. Mr. Shipley?
Yeah. I don't know that I'm qualified to be on this committee, but I'm happy to give a shot at it and review things. So.
Okay. Would somebody like to make a motion?
I'll make that motion that the council create an ad hoc committee consisting of Mr. Shipley, Mr. Hoban, and Mr. Handley, the chair being Mr. Hoban because he's not here, and the vice chair being Mr. Handley. I think that's it. To review the scope and purpose of the neighborhood program per the presentation.
Okay, we have a motion.
I'd like to second that.
Second by Mr. Harding. Let's hear from Mr. Hoban first, if he's willing to chair that committee.
I object. Just kidding. I'm great with that. And thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, I heard the object and thank you for the opportunity. Was there something in between there?
Yes, I'm happy to accept that.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. All right. And
Sure. I will
Okay.
Also,
so we have a motion and a second.
Mr. Shipley's dying to be in one of those positions. Oh, okay.
Any discussion on the motion? All in favor? All hands up here, Mr. Hoban?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, so that motion passes unanimously. And can we hand off the discussion of the scope of the work to this committee and then have them come back and present to the whole council what they, kind of their plan for how to chunk this out and what the scope should be? All right. Thank you. I think we're done with this part of the meeting then. And we do have a closed session. So what, can you instruct us on that, Mr. Strachan? We upstairs in about 5 minutes or?
Yes, we have, if we get upstairs about 5 minutes, we can start a closed meeting. I'll have Brian give you the kind of the legal explanation of why you can have a closed meeting.
Well, we do actually need to vote in this meeting to have the closed meeting.
Thank
So we have two items for discussion. One has to do with strategy regarding real property, the other regarding pending litigation. Those are both permitted by the statute, so it would be appropriate for motion to close the meeting at this time.
Look for a motion.
So moved.
Councilor Ellsworth,
I'll second that.
second by Mr. Harding. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously. We'll see you upstairs.